Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're tackling one of history's greatest puzzles, how an empire that built monuments touching the sky, that made death itself an art form, that turned sand into civilization, just vanished. Ancient Egypt. 3,000 years of pharaohs, pyramids and power, swallowed by the desert like it never happened. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just Cleopatra and a snake. Here's the thing nobody tells you in school, Egypt didn't fall in a day. It was conquered by Libyans, saved by Nubians, crushed by Assyrians, humiliated by Persians, seduced by Greeks, and finally devoured by Rome. Each chapter more dramatic than the last. And through it all, the Nile kept flowing, the temples kept standing, and somehow Egyptian culture kept absorbing its conquerors like quicksand swallows the careless. So before we dive into this epic collapse, smash that like button if you're ready for some real history and drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? New York at midnight? Tokyo at noon? Let me know. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's unravel how the greatest civilization on Earth slowly crumbled into legend. Ready? Let's go. Picture a map of the ancient world. Now imagine you're a power-hungry ruler looking for the perfect piece of real estate to conquer. Where do your eyes land? Exactly where everyone else's did for 3 millennia, right on Egypt. This wasn't coincidence, and it certainly wasn't random. Egypt sat at what can only be described as the most strategically blessed location in the entire ancient world. A geographical jackpot that made it simultaneously the envy and the target of every ambitious empire within marching distance. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea stretched out like a liquid highway connecting Egypt to Greece, Rome, Phoenicia, and every major trading civilization that mattered. This wasn't just a nice view for beachfront property. This was access to the entire known world's commerce, ideas, and unfortunately, armies. Any nation that controlled Egypt automatically controlled a significant chunk of Mediterranean trade, which in ancient terms was roughly equivalent to controlling the internet, global shipping, and the stock market all at once. Not a bad position to be in, unless of course everyone else noticed, which they absolutely did. To the west lay Libya, with its nomadic tribes who spent centuries eyeing Egypt's wealth like hungry neighbours, watching through a fence at a particularly impressive barbecue. These weren't just casual observers. The Libyans represented a constant pressure, a demographic force that would eventually push through Egypt's western defences and, in a twist that would become a recurring theme, end up sitting on the throne themselves. But we'll get to that particular plot twist later. To the east, Palestine and the Levant served as both a buffer zone and a gateway, a corridor connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia, Persia, and the endless parade of eastern empires that rose and fell with almost predictable regularity. This eastern frontier was Egypt's most porous border, a revolving door through which Hyksos, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and eventually Alexander himself would come knocking. Some knocked politely, most did not. And then there was the Nile. If Egypt's geographical position was a jackpot, the Nile was the winning lottery ticket wrapped inside that jackpot. This river wasn't just water, it was life itself. A 4,000-mile lifeline that transformed what should have been uninhabitable desert into one of the most fertile agricultural zones on the planet. Every year, with clockwork reliability that would make modern infrastructure engineers weep with envy, the Nile flooded its banks and deposited rich, black silt across the floodplains. Egyptian farmers didn't need to rotate crops, didn't need to let fields lie fallow, didn't need to pray for rain like their counterparts literally everywhere else in the ancient world. They just planted, waited for the river to do its thing, and harvested abundance. This agricultural miracle had consequences that rippled through every aspect of Egyptian civilization. Surplus food meant surplus population. Surplus population meant surplus labour. Surplus labour meant you could do things like, say, stack 2 million stone blocks into a geometric mountain just because your god king wanted a fancy tomb. The pyramids weren't built by alien technology or lost civilizations. They were built by the Nile, or more precisely by the abundance that the Nile made possible. During flood season, when farming was literally underwater, tens of thousands of workers could be fed, housed, and organised into construction crews without the economy collapsing. Try doing that in Mesopotamia, where irrigation was a constant battle against salt buildup and unpredictable flooding. Good luck building anything taller than a ziggurat. The Nile also created something equally valuable, a natural highway running straight through the heart of the kingdom. Goods, people, ideas, and armies could move up and down Egypt with remarkable ease, travelling by boat rather than trudging through desert sand. This geographical unity was both a blessing and a curse. It made Egypt easy to govern from a central authority, allowing pharaohs to maintain control over vast distances that would have fragmented other ancient states. But it also meant that once an invader controlled the Nile, they controlled Egypt. There was no retreating to mountain strongholds, no guerrilla resistance in dense forests. Egypt was, in strategic terms, a single target that could be captured with a single campaign, if you were strong enough to pull it off. All of this geographical good fortune turned Egypt into something irresistible, a prize worth conquering, worth holding, worth fighting over again and again across 3,000 years of history. The wealth was obvious: gold from Nubia, grain from the Delta, papyrus, linen, natron for mummification, and exotic goods funneled through from Africa, Arabia, and beyond. But beyond mere wealth, Egypt offered legitimacy. To conquer Egypt was to inherit the mantle of the pharaohs, to step into a tradition so ancient and impressive that it could transform foreign barbarians into divine kings overnight. This cultural capital was worth almost as much as the gold. And this brings us to one of history's most fascinating paradoxes: Egyptian culture's almost supernatural ability to absorb its conquerors rather than being destroyed by them. When the Hyksos invaded during the Second Intermediate Period, they didn't impose foreign customs on Egypt. Instead, they adopted Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, and basically went native so thoroughly that within a few generations the only thing foreign about them was their original ethnic background. This pattern would repeat itself with almost comic predictability. Libyans would conquer Egypt and become Egyptian. Nubians would conquer Egypt and become Egyptian. Persians were somewhat resistant to the charm, but even they made gestures toward traditional Egyptian kingship. Greeks under the Ptolemies would become so Egyptian that Cleopatra herself, a woman of Macedonian Greek descent, would be remembered as the quintessential Egyptian queen. This cultural gravity was both Egypt's greatest strength and, in a way, its eventual undoing. The ability to absorb conquerors maintained Egyptian civilization long past the point where the ethnic Egyptians themselves controlled their own destiny. But this same absorption meant that the conquest never stopped. Why would it? Each successful invader became proof that Egypt could be taken and held, that its treasures and prestige were available to anyone bold enough to seize them. Egypt became, in essence, too good at turning enemies into friends, and this advertisement of hospitality brought more enemies to the door. Alexandria stands as the ultimate symbol of this paradox. Founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, this city became the final great centre of Egyptian civilization, a civilization that was by then thoroughly Greek in its ruling class, its language, and its intellectual life. The famous Library of Alexandria, the lighthouse that counted among the Seven Wonders, the museum that served as the ancient world's greatest research institution, all of these were Egyptian in location, but Greek in conception and execution. Alexandria was where Egyptian tradition and Greek innovation merged into something new, something brilliant, and something that would ultimately prove to be Egypt's last great contribution to world civilization. And at the end of this long story stands Cleopatra. Not Cleopatra the First, there were actually 7 of them, but Cleopatra 7, the one everyone means when they say the name. She's become such an icon of Egyptian history that most people forget she was ethnically Greek, that she probably looked more Mediterranean than African, that she spoke Greek as her first language, and was actually the first Ptolemaic ruler who bothered to learn Egyptian at all. But Cleopatra understood something crucial. She was ruling a civilization in twilight, a great power that had become a pawn in the chess game between Roman generals. Her legendary relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just romance. They were survival strategy, desperate attempts to secure Egypt's independence by hitching the kingdom to Rome's rising stars. It didn't work. In 30 BCE, after the defeat of Antony at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra took her own life rather than be paraded through Rome as a conquered trophy. The exact method remains debated. The snake story is probably propaganda, and poison or some other means seems more likely, but the symbolism was unmistakable. With Cleopatra died the last independent Egyptian monarch, and Egypt became just another province of Rome, its grain feeding Roman armies, its treasures decorating Roman temples, its ancient traditions slowly fading under the weight of Roman administration and, eventually, Christianity. But here's what makes Egypt's story so compelling. The culture never truly died. It was conquered, yes. It was administered by foreigners for the last millennium of its ancient existence. But Egyptian religion, Egyptian art, Egyptian concepts of kingship and the afterlife, these things proved remarkably resilient. They influenced their conquerors even as those conquerors ruled over them. Greek philosophers came to Egypt and found wisdom. Roman emperors had themselves depicted as pharaohs. Even Christianity, which would eventually replace the ancient religion entirely, absorbed Egyptian symbols and concepts, transforming Isis into Mary, Horus into Christ, and ancient temples into churches and monasteries. This is the paradox we'll be exploring throughout this journey. A civilization so powerful that it shaped everyone who conquered it, yet so vulnerable that conquest became its permanent condition. Egypt didn't fall in one dramatic collapse. It was slowly absorbed layer by layer, conqueror by conqueror, until the ancient traditions became memories, then myths, then archaeological curiosities. The Nile still flows, the pyramids still stand, but the world that built them is gone, and understanding how it disappeared requires us to go back to the beginning of the end. Which brings us to what historians call the New Kingdom, and specifically to the moment when Egypt was at the absolute peak of its power, because nothing illustrates a fall quite like knowing exactly how high the climb was first. The New Kingdom period, spanning roughly from 1550 to 1077 BCE, represents ancient Egypt at its most impressive, most powerful, and most influential. This was the age of empire when Egyptian armies pushed south into Nubia, east into Palestine and Syria, and established Egypt as the dominant superpower of the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. Names from this period still echo through history: Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses II. These weren't just kings, they were god kings who commanded resources and wielded power on a scale that wouldn't be seen again in the region for centuries. The wealth during this period was simply staggering. Gold flowed into Egypt from Nubian mines in quantities that made the pharaohs quite literally the richest rulers on earth. A famous letter from a Babylonian king to Amenhotep III casually mentions that in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust, and this wasn't flattery, it was foreign policy jealousy. Egyptian craftsmen transformed this gold into objects of such exquisite beauty that when Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered 3,000 years later, the treasures inside still had the power to take Howard Carter's breath away. And Tutankhamun, remember, was a minor king who died young. Imagine what the tombs of truly great pharaohs like Amenhotep III or Ramesses II must have contained before the looters got to them. Temple complexes during the New Kingdom reached scales that still defy easy comprehension. Karnak, the great temple of Amun at Thebes, became the largest religious structure ever built in the ancient world. A sprawling complex of pylons, courtyards, obelisks, and hypostyle halls that covered over 200 acres. The Great Hypostyle Hall alone contained 134 massive columns, some of them 70 feet tall and so thick that it would take a dozen people holding hands to encircle their bases. Walking through Karnak even today, as a tourist with air conditioning waiting back at the hotel, is an overwhelming experience. Imagine being an ancient Egyptian, approaching this monument to divine power for the first time. The propaganda effect must have been absolutely crushing, which was, of course, entirely the point. Military power matched this architectural grandeur. Egyptian armies during the New Kingdom were professional, disciplined, and technologically advanced by the standards of the era. They had adopted the horse-drawn chariot from their Hyksos conquerors and turned it into a weapon system so effective that chariot units became the elite strike force of Egyptian military power. Pharaohs like Thutmose III personally led campaigns that pushed Egyptian control as far north as the Euphrates River, creating an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in modern Sudan to the borders of the Hittite Empire in modern Turkey. Egypt wasn't just a regional power, it was the power, the standard against which all other Bronze Age kingdoms measured themselves. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where we start to see those first cracks that would eventually shatter this golden age. Because the New Kingdom wasn't just the peak of Egyptian power, it was also the beginning of a slow, almost imperceptible decline that would accelerate over the following centuries. And the first signs of trouble came not from foreign enemies, but from within Egyptian society itself, in the most unexpected place: the belief system that had defined Egyptian civilization for 2,000 years. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand what made Egyptian religion unique. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, who generally viewed death as a dreary afterthought, a shadowy underworld where souls drifted without purpose, Egyptians built their entire civilization around preparing for a glorious afterlife. Death wasn't the end, it was a transition to something better, a journey to the field of reeds where the blessed dead lived forever in agricultural paradise. But this blessed afterlife wasn't automatic. It required proper preparation, mummification to preserve the body, grave goods to sustain the spirit, spells and rituals to navigate the dangers of the underworld. Most importantly, it required a secure tomb where the mummy and its treasures could rest undisturbed for eternity. This obsession with the afterlife drove Egyptian civilization in ways that are hard to overstate. The pyramids, the elaborate tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the vast mortuary temples, the armies of priests performing daily rituals, all of this was infrastructure for death, an economic and social system built around the assumption that proper burial led to eternal life. Egyptians didn't build pyramids because they had nothing better to do. They built pyramids because the afterlife was more real to them than this life, because eternal existence seemed worth any amount of earthly sacrifice. But what happens when people stop believing? What happens when the promise of eternal life starts to look less like religious truth and more like an expensive fantasy? This is what began to happen during the later New Kingdom, and the evidence comes from a source so unexpected that it took archaeologists decades to understand its significance: the tombs themselves. The Valley of the Kings was supposed to solve a problem that had plagued Egyptian burial practices since the Pyramid Age: tomb robbery. The pyramids, for all their impressive engineering, were basically giant advertisements saying "treasure inside." Grave robbers had been breaking into them almost since they were built, and by the New Kingdom, the royal tombs of the Pyramid Age had been thoroughly looted. The solution was secrecy. Instead of obvious monuments, the New Kingdom pharaohs would be buried in hidden tombs cut into a remote desert valley, far from population centres, guarded by dedicated police forces. The tomb locations would be kept secret, the workers who built them sequestered in special villages where their movements could be monitored. No more pyramids screaming "rob me," just anonymous holes in the rock that would protect the royal dead for eternity. It didn't work. Not even close. The evidence from the Valley of the Kings tells a story of almost immediate failure. Tomb robbery wasn't a later phenomenon, something that happened after Egyptian civilization collapsed. It was happening during the New Kingdom itself, sometimes within decades of a pharaoh's burial. We have court records from the reign of Ramesses IX documenting systematic looting of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and neighbouring areas. The testimony from these ancient trials is both horrifying and darkly funny, as tomb robbers describe in matter-of-fact detail how they broke into supposedly secure tombs, stripped mummies of their jewellery, and divided the loot among themselves. One famous passage describes robbers setting fire to a mummy's wrappings to retrieve the gold beneath. So much for eternal life in the field of reeds. But here's where the story gets really disturbing. The tomb robbers weren't just random criminals. Many of them were the very people entrusted with protecting and maintaining the royal tombs. Priests, temple workers, necropolis guards, people who were supposed to believe most deeply in the sacredness of royal burials, were participating in systematic looting. The corruption went high up the social ladder. Some evidence suggests that even high-ranking officials were involved in or aware of the tomb robbery and were taking their cut. This wasn't just petty theft. It was institutional corruption that suggested something had gone deeply wrong with Egyptian society. What made people who theoretically believed in the afterlife willing to condemn their own kings to eternal suffering by destroying their tombs? The most obvious answer is that they didn't believe anymore, or at least didn't believe strongly enough for it to outweigh the very tangible benefits of selling stolen gold. This loss of faith represents one of the most significant cultural shifts in Egyptian history, a slow erosion of the beliefs that had motivated pyramid building and sustained the elaborate mortuary cults that employed thousands of priests across the country. We can trace this erosion in other ways too. Literary texts from the late New Kingdom and subsequent periods express increasing skepticism about traditional religious promises. One famous harper's song found in several tombs basically advises listeners to enjoy life now because no one really knows what happens after death. None comes from there to tell us how they fare, the song notes, with what sounds suspiciously like agnosticism. This wasn't atheism in the modern sense, but it was a significant departure from the confident afterlife promises of earlier periods. The economic implications of this loss of faith were enormous. The mortuary cult system, the network of priests, temples and endowments that maintained rituals for dead kings and nobles, consumed a staggering portion of Egyptian resources. Temple estates controlled vast agricultural lands, and the priests who served these estates were exempt from taxation and many forms of labour service. As long as everyone believed in the importance of these cults, this made perfect sense. You were essentially paying for your relatives' eternal well-being. But if the afterlife was uncertain, if the priests were corrupt, if the whole system was starting to look like an elaborate scam, well, perhaps those temple lands could be better used elsewhere. The tension between the temple priesthoods and the royal government became one of the defining features of late New Kingdom politics. Pharaohs tried various strategies to rein in priestly power. Akhenaten's famous religious revolution, attempting to replace the traditional gods with worship of the sun disk Aten, was partly a political move to break the power of the Amun priesthood. It failed spectacularly, and the traditional religion was restored within a generation. But the underlying conflict remained, an increasingly powerful and wealthy temple establishment facing off against royal authority that was slowly weakening. By the end of the New Kingdom, this conflict would tear Egypt apart. The last truly effective pharaoh of the New Kingdom was Ramesses III, who ruled in the first half of the 12th century BCE and faced challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser kings. Foreign invasions from the mysterious Sea Peoples, a coalition of Mediterranean raiders whose exact origins remain debated, threatened Egypt from the north. Libyan tribes pushed against the western borders with increasing aggression. Economic problems, possibly related to climate change that was ending the Bronze Age prosperity across the entire Mediterranean world, created internal pressures. Ramesses III managed to defeat these threats through a combination of military skill and luck, but his reign also saw something unprecedented in Egyptian history, a labour strike by the workers who built the royal tombs, demanding back pay that the government couldn't afford to provide. Let that sink in. The workers building the tomb of the living god king went on strike because the divine government couldn't make payroll. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a symbolic collapse. If the pharaoh couldn't even pay the men building his own tomb, what exactly was divine kingship worth? After Ramesses III, the decline accelerated. His successors, a parade of increasingly ineffective Ramesses numbered Phi through Eand, watched helplessly as royal authority crumbled. The tomb robbery crisis reached its peak during this period, with court records showing systematic looting and corruption that the government seemed powerless to stop. Prices for basic goods fluctuated wildly, suggesting economic instability. Local officials increasingly acted on their own authority, ignoring directives from the capital. Most dramatically, power began to split geographically. In the south, around Thebes and the great temple complex of Karnak, the high priests of Amun accumulated political and military power that rivaled the pharaohs themselves. These weren't just religious figures anymore, they commanded armies, controlled territories, and eventually began putting their names in royal cartouches, the oval frames traditionally reserved for kings. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1077 BCE, Egypt effectively split into two states, a northern kingdom ruled by the pharaohs from the delta city of Tanis, and a southern theocracy ruled by the high priests of Amun from Thebes. This division wasn't formalised as a civil war. The two powers seemed to have reached some kind of understanding, intermarrying and recognising each other's authority within their respective zones. But it represented a fundamental break from the unified kingdom that had defined Egyptian civilization for millennia. Egypt was now two states pretending to be one, and this weakness would prove irresistible to foreign observers who had long coveted Egyptian wealth. The internal fractures went deeper than mere politics. The new kingdom had been built on a social system that required massive coordinated effort, building projects, military campaigns, agricultural management, religious ceremonies. All of this required a functioning central authority that could direct resources and labour across the entire kingdom. As that central authority weakened, the grand projects stopped. No more royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. No more massive temple expansions. The age of building was over, and what followed was an age of maintaining, and eventually of decline. The crisis of faith that manifested in tomb robbery and priestly corruption reflected something deeper, a loss of confidence in the systems that had sustained Egyptian civilization for so long. when pharaohs could no longer pay their workers, when priests stole from the gods they were supposed to serve, when the promise of eternal life seemed less certain than the prospect of immediate profit. These were symptoms of a society losing its grip on its own identity. Egypt in the late New Kingdom was still fabulously wealthy by contemporary standards, still culturally sophisticated, still capable of producing impressive art and literature. But something essential had been lost, some core conviction that had made the earlier achievements possible. Foreign observers noticed. The Libyans to the west, who had been raiding and settling along Egypt's borders for centuries, saw an opportunity. These were tough desert people, hardened by life in an unforgiving landscape, and they had been slowly infiltrating Egyptian society for generations. Libyan soldiers served in the Egyptian army. Libyan communities had established themselves in the Western Delta. They knew Egypt intimately, its wealth, its weaknesses, and increasingly its internal divisions. When the New Kingdom finally collapsed into its fragmented successor states, the Libyans were perfectly positioned to take advantage. But before we get to the Libyan takeover, we need to understand what made this internal collapse so devastating. Egypt had faced foreign invasions before. The Hyksos had conquered the north during the Second Intermediate Period, but it had always bounced back, driving out the foreigners and restoring native rule. What made the late New Kingdom different was that the collapse came from within. It wasn't foreign armies that ended the New Kingdom. It was Egyptian priests robbing Egyptian tombs, Egyptian officials ignoring Egyptian kings, Egyptian society losing faith in Egyptian gods. The foreign conquests that followed were consequences, not causes, of this internal disintegration. There's a lesson here about how civilizations fall, and it's not the simple story of barbarians at the gates that we often tell ourselves. Egypt's borders in the late New Kingdom were still defensible. Its armies were still formidable. Its wealth, though diminished from the glory days, was still substantial. What Egypt lacked was not resources, but conviction. The shared belief that made coordinated effort possible, the faith that gave meaning to sacrifice, the cultural confidence that had built pyramids and conquered empires. When that conviction crumbled, everything else followed. The priests who robbed tombs probably didn't think they were ending a civilization. The local officials who ignored royal commands probably didn't see themselves as traitors. The workers who went on strike were just trying to feed their families. Each individual decision made sense in context. Why maintain faith in a system that seemed to be failing you? But collectively, these rational individual choices created an irrational collective outcome, the slow-motion suicide of one of history's greatest civilizations. This is what we're watching when we study Egypt's decline. Not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual loss of the things that made Egypt, Egypt. The religion didn't disappear overnight. It slowly lost its grip on people's imaginations. The royal authority didn't collapse in a day. It slowly became irrelevant to people's daily lives. The unity that had defined Egypt since its legendary founding under King Menes slowly fractured into regional powers that barely recognized each other's legitimacy. By the time foreign conquerors arrived to pick up the pieces, there wasn't much left to conquer, just a divided land that remembered being great but couldn't quite figure out how to be great again. And yet, and this is crucial, Egypt never stopped being Egypt. Even in its weakened, divided state, Egyptian culture remained distinctive, recognizable, and somehow magnetic. The foreigners who conquered Egypt didn't impose their own civilizations. Instead, they adopted Egyptian civilization, wrapped themselves in pharaonic symbolism, and ruled as Egyptian kings. This pattern would continue for centuries, through Libyans and Nubians and Persians and Greeks and finally Romans. Each conquest seemed like the end, and each time Egyptian culture absorbed its conquerors and continued, transformed but unbroken. This remarkable persistence is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Egypt's decline. Most conquered civilizations disappear, absorbed into their conquerors' cultures, their languages replaced, their religions forgotten. Egypt somehow reversed this dynamic, turning its conquerors into Egyptians rather than being turned into something else. The civilization was too powerful to die, even when it became too weak to defend itself. It continued under foreign management, maintained by people who weren't ethnically Egyptian, but who became Egyptian in every meaningful cultural sense. Understanding this persistence requires us to understand what made Egyptian culture so uniquely compelling: its art, its religion, its concept of divine kingship, its vision of cosmic order represented by Ma'at. These ideas were so fully developed, so internally consistent, so aesthetically powerful, that they seem to offer answers to questions every civilization asks. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens after we die? Egypt's answers to these questions weren't just satisfying, they were addictive. Once you accepted the Egyptian worldview, alternatives seemed pale and unconvincing. The Greeks who conquered Egypt under Alexander weren't barbarians. They had their own sophisticated culture, their own impressive philosophical traditions, their own compelling mythology. Yet even the Greeks found Egypt irresistible. Alexander himself was crowned as pharaoh in the traditional manner, and his successors, the Ptolemies, spent centuries trying to be proper Egyptian kings. They built temples indistinguishable from those of native dynasties, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside Greek ones, and eventually produced Cleopatra, who was Greek in blood but Egyptian in soul. If even the Greeks couldn't resist Egyptian culture, what chance did the Libyans or Nubians have? But persistence isn't the same as health. Egyptian civilization persisted under foreign rule the way a patient might persist on life support, technically alive but far from thriving. The great building projects became smaller and less frequent. The religious innovation stopped. Instead of developing new ideas, priests simply repeated old formulas with increasingly mechanical devotion. The art, while still beautiful, became repetitive, copying ancient models rather than creating new ones. Egypt was preserved, but it was preserved like a museum exhibit, impressive to look at but no longer growing, no longer creating, no longer fully alive. The first foreign rulers to benefit from Egypt's internal collapse were the Libyans, and their story illustrates both the power of Egyptian culture to absorb outsiders and the limitations of that absorption. But that's a tale that deserves its own attention, because the Libyan period introduces themes that would repeat throughout Egypt's long twilight. Foreign rulers desperately trying to be Egyptian, Egyptian traditions adapting to foreign management, and the slow transformation of a living culture into ancient tradition. The New Kingdom was over, and something new was beginning, something that would carry Egyptian civilization forward while fundamentally changing what that civilization meant. The cracks that appeared in the New Kingdom would never fully heal. The loss of faith that turned priests into tomb robbers would never be fully restored. The political division that split Egypt into northern and southern kingdoms would recur again and again, becoming almost the default state of Egyptian politics. What had been the world's most stable, most unified, most confident civilization became something more fragile, more dependent on foreign strength, more uncertain of its own identity. Egypt was still Egypt, but it was an Egypt that had lost something essential, and the next 1,000 years would be spent trying to recover what had been lost while never quite succeeding. The glory was fading. The gold was tarnishing. The gods were losing their power over human hearts. And waiting in the wings, watching this slow-motion collapse with calculating eyes, were the peoples who would inherit Egypt's body if not its soul: Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally Romans. Each would take their turn ruling the land of the Nile, and each would be transformed by what they conquered, becoming in some sense Egyptian, even as they ended Egypt's independence forever. This is the story we're following. Not a single dramatic fall, but a long, slow descent from Golden Peak to Dusty Plain, with Egypt somehow remaining itself through centuries of foreign domination. It's a story about the power of culture and the limits of that power, about conquest and absorption, about belief and disillusion. And it starts here, in the twilight of the New Kingdom, when the pharaohs still sat on their thrones but the foundations beneath them had already begun to crumble. Consider for a moment the psychology of living through such a decline. The Egyptians of the late New Kingdom weren't stupid. They knew their civilization had seen better days. They could walk through temple complexes built by their ancestors and see the difference between ancient craftsmanship and contemporary work. They could read hieroglyphic records of military victories that their own armies could no longer match. They could compare the humble tombs of their minor kings to the spectacular monuments of the great pharaohs and understand viscerally that something had been lost. This awareness created a peculiar cultural atmosphere, part nostalgia, part despair, part stubborn determination to maintain traditions even when those traditions had lost their original meaning. Egyptian art of this period became increasingly backward-looking, deliberately imitating styles from centuries earlier, as if copying the forms could somehow recapture the spirit. Religious texts were compiled and standardized, preserving ancient knowledge but rarely adding to it. The culture was curating itself, turning from a living tradition into a carefully maintained archive. There's something poignant about this self-conscious preservation. These people genuinely loved their civilization and desperately wanted it to survive. They memorized ancient hymns, performed ancient rituals, maintained ancient customs not because they were blindly traditional, but because they understood that these things mattered, that losing them would mean losing something essential about what it meant to be Egyptian. In a sense, they were already treating their own culture as historical heritage, worthy of protection and documentation, which is exactly what it would become under foreign rule. The crisis of the late New Kingdom also accelerated social changes that had been building for centuries. The strict hierarchies that had defined earlier periods began to blur as central authority weakened. Local strongmen accumulated power that would have been unthinkable under a strong pharaoh. Merchant classes grew more prominent as trade networks adapted to political fragmentation. The army, always important in Egyptian society, became even more central to politics as military commanders realised that they could make and unmake kings. This militarisation of Egyptian politics was particularly significant for what came next. The pharaohs of the late New Kingdom increasingly relied on foreign mercenaries, especially Libyans, to fill out their armies. These weren't slave soldiers or desperate refugees. They were professional warriors attracted by Egyptian wealth and the possibility of land grants as payment for service. Over time, Libyan soldiers and their families established communities throughout Egypt, particularly in the Delta region. They maintained their own cultural identity to some extent, their distinctive feathered headdresses and tribal organisations, but they also integrated into Egyptian society, learning the language, worshipping Egyptian gods, and eventually claiming Egyptian titles. This Libyan military presence was a time bomb waiting to go off. As long as strong pharaohs controlled the army, foreign soldiers were useful tools. But once royal authority weakened past a certain point, what was to stop a successful Libyan general from deciding that he could do the job better than the ineffective native dynasties? The answer, it turned out, was nothing at all. The transition from Egyptian to Libyan rule wasn't a dramatic invasion, but a gradual takeover. Libyan military commanders had been accumulating titles and power for generations, intermarrying with Egyptian nobility, building power bases in strategically important cities. When the last native pharaohs of the New Kingdom died out or were pushed aside, Libyan generals simply stepped into the vacancy. To them, this probably didn't feel like conquest. They had been part of Egyptian society for so long that ruling it seemed like a natural promotion, rather than a foreign takeover. But the native Egyptian population knew the difference. However Egyptian the Libyan rulers tried to be, and they tried very hard indeed, there was always an awareness that something fundamental had changed. The god-kings who had ruled Egypt since the beginning of time were suddenly foreigners, strangers who wore Egyptian crowns and performed Egyptian rituals, but whose ancestors had come from the desert, who spoke with foreign accents and maintained foreign customs alongside their Egyptian obligations. This awareness would colour Egyptian attitudes toward their rulers for the rest of ancient history, creating a persistent tension between cultural absorption and ethnic consciousness. The economic disruptions of the late New Kingdom had lasting consequences as well. The elaborate mortuary economy that had driven so much Egyptian activity, the tomb building, the mummification industry, the maintenance of funerary cults, was severely damaged by the tomb robbery crisis and the accompanying loss of faith. This wasn't just a matter of religious belief, it was economic infrastructure. Thousands of people had earned their livelihoods from death-related industries, and when demand for elaborate burials declined, those livelihoods disappeared. The famous workmen's village at Deir el-Medina, home to the craftsmen who built royal tombs, was eventually abandoned as the New Kingdom ended. Its residents dispersed, their specialised skills no longer needed, their community dissolved. The centralised grain distribution systems that had fed workers on state projects broke down as well, replaced by more localised and chaotic economic arrangements. Archaeological evidence suggests increased economic inequality during this period, with some families accumulating wealth while others struggled. The social contract that had bound Egyptian society together, the pharaoh provides order and sustenance, the people provide labour and loyalty, was fraying badly. What remained was still recognisably Egyptian, but it was a damaged Egypt, an Egypt that had lost confidence in its own systems and institutions. International trade patterns also shifted during this transition. Egypt's position as a dominant player in Mediterranean commerce had depended partly on political stability and effective administration. As both declined, trade routes began to bypass Egypt or exploit its weakness. The collapse of the broader Bronze Age system around 1200 BCE, which destroyed or weakened civilizations from Greece to Mesopotamia, further disrupted the trade networks that had enriched the New Kingdom. Egypt was not alone in suffering during this period. It was part of a general Mediterranean crisis, but Egypt's particular version of the crisis left it vulnerable in ways that would be exploited by later conquerors. Perhaps most importantly, the late New Kingdom saw a transformation in how Egyptians understood their own history. Earlier generations had viewed Egyptian civilization as eternal and unchanging, a perfect order established at the beginning of time and maintained by the pharaohs through their performance of sacred rituals. This ideology had always been somewhat fictional. Egyptian history was actually full of changes and developments, but it served important purposes, providing stability and continuity in a world that valued both highly. The crisis of the late New Kingdom made this fiction increasingly hard to maintain. When kings couldn't pay their workers, when priests robbed tombs, when foreign soldiers occupied the delta, the pretense of eternal perfection became obviously absurd. Egyptians began to develop a more historical consciousness, acknowledging that things had been better in the past and might be better again in the future, but weren't particularly good right now. This historical awareness was both a symptom of decline and a tool for survival. It allowed Egyptians to maintain hope that their civilization could be restored while acknowledging the reality of its current weakness. The textual evidence from this period reflects this changed consciousness. Chronicles were compiled that traced Egyptian history from the earliest dynasties, emphasizing past greatness in ways that implicitly criticized present failures. Literary texts explored themes of change and impermanence that would have been alien to earlier Egyptian thought. The confident assertions of eternal order gave way to more nuanced reflections on the nature of time, the transience of human achievements, and the uncertain relationship between past and future. This psychological transformation was perhaps the deepest change of all. Egypt remained physically impressive. The monuments still stood, the Nile still flooded, the land still produced abundant grain. But the mental landscape had shifted fundamentally. Egyptians no longer saw their civilization as naturally dominant and eternal. They saw it as vulnerable, as something that needed to be actively protected and maintained. This defensive posture would characterize Egyptian culture for the rest of its ancient history, even during periods of political strength and cultural creativity. The weight of the past bore down heavily on those who lived through this transition. Every temple they entered reminded them of what their ancestors had achieved. Every ancient text they read measured their own accomplishments against standards they could no longer meet. This burden of historical memory was both crushing and inspiring. Crushing because it made contemporary failures so obvious, inspiring because it provided models for what restoration might look like. Egyptian revivals over the following centuries would draw constantly on New Kingdom precedents, trying to recapture past glory by imitating past forms. The international context of this transition deserves attention as well. Egypt's neighbours noticed its weakness, and this changed regional dynamics in ways that would have long-term consequences. The Libyans, who eventually took power, had been probing Egyptian defences for generations. Their success encouraged others to try their luck. The Nubians to the south, who had been subjects of Egyptian empire during the New Kingdom, began developing their own state structures that would eventually allow them to conquer Egypt in turn. Even distant powers like Assyria began including Egypt in their strategic calculations, seeing it as a potential prize rather than an equal partner. This changing international perception was perhaps the most dangerous legacy of the late New Kingdom crisis. For centuries, Egypt had been the superpower, the civilization that others feared and envied. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was becoming something else, a wealthy but weak land, rich enough to be worth conquering but not strong enough to resist effectively. This reputation would attract conquerors for the next 1,000 years, each seeing Egypt as an opportunity rather than a threat. Yet even in decline, Egypt retained certain advantages. Its agricultural wealth remained substantial. The Nile's annual floods didn't care about political turmoil. Its cultural prestige, though dimmed, was still considerable. Claiming Egyptian legitimacy still meant something in the wider world. Its geographical barriers, deserts to east and west, sea to the north, cataracts to the south, still provided some protection against invasion. These advantages would allow Egypt to maintain a semblance of independence and cultural distinctiveness, long after other Bronze Age civilizations had vanished entirely. The next chapter would bring new rulers, new challenges, and new attempts to restore what had been lost. But the Egypt that emerged from the New Kingdom crisis would never recapture the confident power of the Golden Age. It would be a civilization living in the shadow of its own past, struggling to maintain traditions that once had seemed eternal, and wondering whether the gods who had protected Egypt for so long had finally turned their faces away. The Libyans had been watching Egypt for a very long time. Generations, actually. From their perspective, in the arid lands west of the Nile Delta, Egypt must have looked like paradise. A ribbon of green fertility cutting through endless desert, wealthy beyond imagining, sophisticated beyond comprehension, and increasingly, tantalizingly weak. For centuries, Libyan tribes had probed Egyptian borders, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes serving as mercenaries in Egyptian armies. They knew Egypt intimately, understood its strengths and vulnerabilities, and by the mid-10th century BCE, they were ready to stop being observers and start being rulers. The transition happened around 945 BCE, when a Libyan military commander named Shoshenq seized the throne and established what historians call the 22nd dynasty. This wasn't a dramatic invasion with armies clashing on battlefields. It was more like a corporate takeover, executed by people who had been working their way up the organisational chart for generations. Shoshenq's ancestors had been serving Egyptian kings for over a century, accumulating titles, estates and political connections. By the time Shoshenq made his move, Libyans controlled significant portions of the Egyptian military and had intermarried extensively with Egyptian nobility. The actual seizure of power was almost anticlimactic, a formalisation of influence that had been building for decades. But here's where things get interesting, and where the Libyan period becomes a fascinating case study in what happens when conquerors try to become the conquered. The Libyans didn't want to transform Egypt into something Libyan. They wanted to transform themselves into something Egyptian. They wanted to be pharaohs, real pharaohs, accepted by the gods and the people as legitimate successors to 3,000 years of divine kingship. This was an ambitious goal, roughly equivalent to someone buying a historic mansion and trying to convince the neighbours they'd always lived there. The Libyans gave it their best shot, and the results were complicated. Shoshenq, the founder of the dynasty, understood that legitimacy in Egypt wasn't just about military power. It was about symbols, rituals, and the appearance of continuity with the past. So he did what any sensible usurper would do. He wrapped himself in every piece of traditional pharaonic imagery he could find. The royal titulary, those elaborate strings of names and epithets that identified Egyptian kings. Shoshenq adopted the full set, complete with Horus names, two ladies' names, golden Horus names, and throne names that connected him to the sun god Ra. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, he wore it in every official representation. The ceremonial beard, the crook and flail, the uraeus cobra on his forehead, every symbol that said "I am Pharaoh" became part of Shoshenq's image. The jewellery is particularly telling. Libyan rulers of this period developed a distinctive style of royal regalia that combined traditional Egyptian elements with what can only be described as enthusiastic overcompensation. Massive gold bracelets inscribed with royal cartouches, elaborate pectorals featuring Horus and other protective deities, rings and amulets bearing every symbol of legitimate kingship. The Libyan pharaohs loaded themselves with enough metal to set off airport security from a mile away. If you couldn't tell they were real pharaohs from their policies, you could certainly tell from their accessories. The message was clear. We belong here, we've always belonged here, and look at all this authentic Egyptian stuff we're wearing to prove it. Shoshenq also invested heavily in temple building and renovation, understanding that nothing says legitimate pharaoh quite like adding your name to Egypt's sacred architecture. At Karnak, the great temple of Amun that had been the religious heart of Egypt for centuries, Shoshenq constructed a massive gateway and colonnade, inscribing it with reliefs depicting his military victories. One particularly famous scene shows him smiting foreign enemies in the traditional pharaonic pose, arm raised, weapon in hand, captives cowering below. The fact that Shoshenq's ancestors had been among those foreign enemies just a few generations earlier was conveniently overlooked. History, as they say, is written by the victors, and the victors had excellent sculptors. The military campaign depicted in those Karnak reliefs deserves attention, because it represents both the high point of Libyan ambition and a preview of the problems to come. Around 925 BCE, Shoshenq led a major military expedition into Palestine, attacking both the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah. This campaign is actually mentioned in the Bible, where Shoshenq appears as Shishak, king of Egypt, who attacked Jerusalem and carried off treasures from the Temple of Solomon. The biblical account and the Egyptian reliefs don't match up perfectly. They rarely do when the same events are described by different sides. But the basic fact of a major Egyptian military intervention in the Levant is confirmed by multiple sources. This campaign was significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that Egypt under Libyan rule was still capable of projecting power beyond its borders, still a force to be reckoned with in regional politics. The New Kingdom Empire was long gone, but Egypt could still field armies and intimidate neighbours when properly motivated. Second, and more importantly for Shoshenq's purposes, the campaign provided exactly the kind of traditional pharaonic activity that legitimised his rule. Egyptian kings were supposed to smite foreigners. It was practically in the job description, and Shoshenq's Palestinian campaign allowed him to perform this role convincingly. But here's the thing about military campaigns. They're expensive, they're risky, and they require a level of organisational coordination that the Libyan state was increasingly unable to sustain. Shoshenq's campaign was impressive, but it wasn't followed by effective occupation or long-term control. The Egyptians collected tribute, knocked some heads together, and went home, leaving the political situation in Palestine essentially unchanged. This pattern of impressive but ultimately ineffective military action would characterise Libyan rule throughout its duration. Lots of sound and fury, ultimately signifying not much at all. The fundamental problem with Libyan Egypt wasn't military or economic, it was structural. The Libyans had come to power as military strongmen, and they understood power in military terms. Their political system was essentially a network of competing military commands, each controlled by a member of the extended royal family or a powerful general, each jealously guarding its own territory and resources. This worked fine when a strong king like Shoshenq could keep everyone in line through a combination of personal authority and the promise of shared plunder. It worked considerably less fine when weaker kings inherited the throne and found themselves presiding over a collection of semi-independent warlords who happened to share their last name. The comparison to medieval European feudalism is tempting but not quite accurate. Feudalism, for all its problems, had a theoretical framework of mutual obligations that provided some basis for political order. The Libyan system had no such framework. It was raw power politics dressed up in pharaonic costume, and it began to fragment almost immediately after Shoshenq's death. His successors found themselves constantly balancing, bribing, and occasionally fighting their own relatives, who controlled military forces and territories that should have been under royal command but increasingly weren't. The geography of this fragmentation is important to understand. The Libyans had their power base in the delta region of Lower Egypt, particularly around the cities of Bubastis, Tanis, and later Sais. This was where their communities had been established during the late New Kingdom, where their tribal structures remained strongest, and where their military power was most concentrated. Upper Egypt, meanwhile, remained under the effective control of the high priests of Amun at Thebes, who had been running their own semi-independent theocracy since the end of the New Kingdom. The Libyan pharaohs claimed authority over all of Egypt, but their actual control was largely limited to the north. This north-south division wasn't new. It had existed in some form since the end of the New Kingdom, but under Libyan rule it became institutionalized in ways that made reunification increasingly difficult. The Theban priests were Egyptian, not Libyan, and they had their own ideas about who should be running things. They acknowledged the Libyan pharaohs in formal documents and participated in certain royal ceremonies, but they exercised real power in the south and weren't particularly interested in taking orders from the delta. The result was a kingdom that looked unified on paper, but was actually two separate political entities sharing a common cultural heritage and not much else. Within the Libyan-controlled north, further fragmentation occurred as the dynasty progressed. The pharaohs had a habit of appointing their sons and relatives to powerful military commands, presumably hoping that family loyalty would ensure political unity. This strategy, which has failed in approximately 100% of historical cases where it's been tried, failed here as well. Each appointed relative became the founder of his own local dynasty, passing his position to his sons, who passed it to their sons, until Egypt was dotted with mini-kingdoms ruled by cousins who theoretically owed allegiance to the pharaoh but practically did whatever they wanted. By the late 22nd dynasty, around 850–800 BCE, this fragmentation had reached absurd levels. Different branches of the royal family were competing openly for power, sometimes fighting each other in actual military conflicts, sometimes simply ignoring each other and ruling their territories independently. The fiction of unified rule was maintained through elaborate diplomatic protocols. Everyone still used the pharaonic calendar, still acknowledged the same gods, still inscribed their names in proper hieroglyphic style, but the political reality was chaos. Egypt had essentially returned to the conditions of the First Intermediate Period, centuries earlier, when the collapse of the Old Kingdom had fragmented the country into competing local powers. The religious dimension of Libyan rule deserves particular attention because it illustrates the strange contradictions of their attempted assimilation. The Libyans, as we've noted, enthusiastically adopted Egyptian religion, building temples, performing rituals, and presenting themselves as devoted servants of the traditional gods. But Egyptian religion wasn't just a matter of personal belief. It was a complex institutional system controlled by powerful priesthoods with their own interests and agendas. The relationship between Libyan kings and Egyptian priests was never entirely comfortable, a marriage of convenience that both sides exploited for their own purposes. The priests of Amun at Thebes were particularly important in this dynamic. They controlled enormous wealth, temple estates that covered vast areas of Upper Egypt, and they claimed direct communication with Amun, the king of the gods. When important decisions needed to be made, the priest would consult Amun's oracle, and the god would indicate his will through movements of his cult statue during processions. Unsurprisingly, Amun's will tended to align rather closely with the priest's interests, a coincidence that nobody seems to have questioned too loudly. These oracular pronouncements carried enormous weight in Egyptian society, and any pharaoh who wanted to maintain legitimacy needed to stay on good terms with the people who interpreted them. The Libyan pharaohs handled this situation with varying degrees of skill. Some tried to place their own relatives in the high priesthood, hoping to bring this power under royal control. This worked occasionally but created its own problems, as priestly relatives proved just as independent-minded as military relatives. Others simply accepted the Theban priests as semi-autonomous partners, exchanging recognition of royal authority for non-interference in southern affairs. Neither approach really solved the fundamental problem. The pharaoh was supposed to be the supreme intermediary between gods and humans, but in practice, that intermediary role was being performed by priests who had their own agenda. The cultural production of the Libyan period reflects these tensions and contradictions. On the surface, Libyan-era art and architecture followed traditional Egyptian patterns. The same gods, the same hieroglyphic writing system, the same iconographic conventions that had defined Egyptian culture for millennia. But subtle differences began to emerge, hints that something had changed beneath the familiar surface. The quality of craftsmanship declined in some areas, not because the Libyans lacked skill, but because the centralized training systems that had produced generations of master craftsmen were breaking down along with centralized political authority. Regional styles became more pronounced as different areas developed their own artistic traditions, connected to the national tradition but not identical to it. The treatment of the pharaoh in Libyan-era art is particularly revealing. Earlier Egyptian kings had been depicted as almost superhuman figures, idealized and ageless, their features conforming to divine rather than human standards. Libyan pharaohs, by contrast, were often shown with more individualized features, including distinctively Libyan elements like certain hairstyles and facial characteristics. This might seem like simple realism, but it represented a subtle shift in how royal identity was conceived. The pharaoh was no longer purely an office occupied by interchangeable divine beings. He was becoming a specific person with a specific ethnic and family background. This personalization of kingship had implications that would play out over the following centuries. The burial practices of Libyan kings also diverged from earlier traditions in interesting ways. The great royal tombs of the New Kingdom, cut deep into the rock of the Valley of the Kings, were no longer used, partly because Upper Egypt was under Theban priestly control, partly because the elaborate tomb-building traditions of the New Kingdom had been disrupted by the end of that period. Instead, Libyan pharaohs were buried at Tanis, their delta capital, in tombs that were impressive but distinctly different from earlier royal burials. These Tanite tombs were built within temple precincts rather than isolated in desert valleys, and they contained burial goods that mixed traditional Egyptian elements with newer styles and foreign imports. When archaeologists discovered the Tanis royal tombs in the 1930s and 1940s, they found them remarkably intact, one of the few cases where Egyptian royal burials survived more or less complete. The treasures revealed were stunning. Gold masks, elaborate jewellery, silver coffins, a material more precious than gold in Egypt due to its scarcity, and finely crafted grave goods. But even amid this wealth, the differences from earlier periods were apparent. Some objects showed distinct Libyan stylistic influences, others were repurposed from earlier reigns, reused because the Libyan state couldn't or wouldn't commission new work of equivalent quality. The burials were rich, but also somehow improvised, as if the Libyan pharaohs were trying to perform a tradition they didn't entirely understand. The international position of Libyan Egypt presents another window into the dynasty's limitations. During the New Kingdom, Egypt had been a superpower whose diplomatic correspondence filled archives across the Near East. Libyan Egypt maintained some international contacts, but its role in regional affairs was considerably diminished. The fragmentary evidence suggests diplomatic relations with Assyria, Babylon, and various Levantine states, but Egypt was no longer the dominant partner in these relationships. When Assyrian power began to expand westward in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Egypt was among the powers scrambling to respond rather than leading regional coalitions. This diminished international standing had practical consequences. Trade networks that had once centred on Egypt began to bypass it or exploit its weakness. The Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast, which had once been Egyptian vassals or trading partners operating within an Egyptian-dominated system, became independent commercial powers running their own networks across the Mediterranean. Cyprus, Crete, and other Mediterranean islands developed trading relationships that no longer required Egyptian permission or participation. Egypt remained wealthy and important, but it was no longer the centre around which everything else orbited. The religious and cultural influence of Egypt proved more durable than its political power, however. This is one of the more remarkable aspects of Egyptian civilization during its long decline. Even when Egypt couldn't project military force, it continued to project cultural force. The prestige of Egyptian religion, the sophistication of Egyptian art, the sheer age and impressiveness of Egyptian monuments, these things continued to attract admiration and imitation long after Egypt had ceased to be a political threat. Libyans wanted to be Egyptian pharaohs not because Egypt was powerful, but because Egypt was glorious, because Egyptian civilization represented a standard of achievement that other cultures aspired to match. This cultural magnetism created a peculiar dynamic during the Libyan period. The pharaohs ruling Egypt were foreigners, their authority was fragmented, their political system was dysfunctional, and yet they were still pharaohs, still participants in a tradition that commanded enormous respect. Foreign embassies still came to Egyptian temples to seek oracles. Foreign traders still sought Egyptian goods and craftsmanship. Foreign scholars, insofar as the ancient world had scholars, still recognized Egypt as a source of ancient wisdom. The body was weakening, but the spirit remained compelling. The Libyan experiment in becoming Egyptian ultimately failed, not because the Libyans weren't sincere in their adoption of Egyptian culture, they clearly were, but because they couldn't solve the political problems that came with their inheritance. They wore the crowns, performed the rituals, built the temples, and proclaimed themselves divine kings in exactly the manner prescribed by 3,000 years of tradition. But they couldn't maintain the unified state that made all those symbols meaningful. Their Egypt was a collection of competing power centres, held together by cultural memory and not much else, and this fragmentation made it vulnerable to anyone strong enough to exploit it. The ironies of this situation would have been apparent to any thoughtful observer. Here were foreign conquerors who desperately wanted to be native rulers, wearing borrowed legitimacy like an ill-fitting suit, performing ceremonies whose meaning they may not have fully grasped, and presiding over a civilization they genuinely admired but couldn't effectively govern. The Libyans succeeded in becoming Egyptian in the cultural sense. They adopted the religion, learned the language, and participated in the traditions. But they failed in the political sense, never creating the stable, unified state that Egyptian ideology demanded. Their rule was a kind of extended impersonation, convincing in its details but unconvincing in its overall effect. And waiting in the wings, watching this performance with growing interest, were the Nubians. These people from the south, whom Egyptians had once conquered and colonized, had been building their own state in the Upper Nile Valley. They too had absorbed Egyptian culture, perhaps more thoroughly than the Libyans, since they had been under Egyptian influence for even longer. But unlike the Libyans, the Nubians weren't fragmented into competing factions. They were unified, organized, and increasingly ambitious. They looked at Libyan Egypt with its squabbling warlords and its empty pretensions to pharaonic legitimacy, and they saw an opportunity. Egypt needed saving, they believed. Egypt needed a real pharaoh, one who could reunify the kingdom, restore the traditions, and return the land of the Nile to its proper glory. And they were just the people to provide one. The Libyan period thus serves as a bridge between two eras of Egyptian history: the native rule that ended with the new kingdom, and the foreign rule that would characterize most of Egypt's remaining ancient history. The Libyans established a precedent. Foreigners could become pharaohs, could wrap themselves in Egyptian legitimacy, could rule the land of the Nile while claiming to uphold its traditions. This precedent would be followed by Nubians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, each adapting the pharaonic model to their own purposes. But the Libyans also demonstrated the limits of this approach. You could dress like a pharaoh, act like a pharaoh, and call yourself a pharaoh, but if you couldn't maintain political unity and effective governance, the costume would eventually prove to be just that: a costume, not an identity. The 22nd dynasty limped along for about 2 centuries, gradually losing control over more and more of Egypt. By the late 8th century BCE, the situation had become frankly chaotic. Multiple pharaohs claimed the throne simultaneously. Local rulers styled themselves as kings without bothering to acknowledge any higher authority. The priesthood at Thebes operated as a completely independent entity. Egypt had fragmented to a degree not seen since the darkest days of the intermediate periods, and the fiction of Libyan legitimacy was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Into this chaos came the Nubians, marching north with their armies, their fervent devotion to Amun, and their conviction that they were destined to restore Egyptian civilization to its proper glory. They would establish the 25th dynasty, and their rule would be dramatically different from what had come before. But that's a story that deserves its own telling, a tale of cultural revival, architectural ambition, and ultimately devastating defeat at the hands of an enemy more terrible than anything Egypt had yet faced. The Libyan legacy is thus one of transition and ambiguity. They were conquerors who became subjects of Egyptian culture, subjects of Egyptian tradition, subjects of an idea of pharaonic legitimacy that they embraced but couldn't fully embody. Their failures were as instructive as their successes, demonstrating both the power of Egyptian culture to absorb outsiders and the inability of that absorption alone to create effective government. They proved that you could become Egyptian without being able to rule Egypt, that cultural adoption and political competence were separate achievements that didn't necessarily go together. For Egypt itself, the Libyan period was a long lesson in living with diminished expectations. The glories of the new kingdom faded further into memory. The pyramids and temples of ancient kings became monuments to a past that could be admired but not recaptured. Egyptians learned to accommodate foreign rulers, to participate in political systems that no longer centred on native authority, to maintain their cultural traditions even when the institutions that had created those traditions were weakening. This adaptability would serve Egyptian civilization well in the difficult centuries to come, when even more dramatic accommodations would be required. The religious life of the Libyan period evolved in response to these changed circumstances. Temple cults continued to function, often with increased emphasis on oracle consultations and personal piety, rather than state-organised ceremonies. The gods remained important, but the relationship between worshippers and deities became more individual, less mediated by royal authority. This shift toward personal religion was already underway in the late New Kingdom, but it accelerated under Libyan rule as the pharaoh's role as cosmic intermediary became more theoretical than practical. The literary and intellectual production of the Libyan period is difficult to assess because relatively little has survived. What we have suggests continuity with earlier traditions, copies of classic texts, maintenance of scribal schools, preservation of religious knowledge, but not much innovation. The period was one of conservation rather than creation, of maintaining inherited wisdom rather than adding to it. This was perhaps appropriate for a society that had lost confidence in its ability to match the achievements of the past, that was focused on preservation rather than progress. The Libyan rulers themselves remain somewhat mysterious figures, their personalities largely hidden behind the conventional imagery of pharaonic propaganda. We know their names, their reign lengths, their building projects and military campaigns, but we don't really know them as individuals. They appear in the historical record as a series of throne names and epithets, indistinguishable from one another except for specialists who can track the subtle changes in titulary and iconography. This anonymity is itself significant. These were rulers who adopted a tradition rather than transforming it, who filled a role rather than redefining it. They were pharaohs by imitation, competent performers of a script they hadn't written. The artistic legacy of the period shows this imitative quality clearly. Libyan-era works follow New Kingdom models so closely that scholars sometimes have difficulty dating them without inscriptional evidence. This wasn't lack of creativity so much as deliberate policy. The Libyan rulers wanted their art to look as traditional as possible, to blend seamlessly into the long history of Egyptian artistic production. In this, they largely succeeded. Their temples and statues could pass for works of earlier periods unless you knew exactly what to look for. But success in imitation isn't the same as success in creation, and the Libyan period produced no artistic innovations that would influence later developments. The political fragmentation of the period had economic consequences that affected ordinary Egyptians as much as the elite. The breakdown of central authority disrupted trade networks, made travel more dangerous, and reduced the efficiency of agricultural management. The elaborate systems of granaries, redistribution, and corvée labour that had characterised the unified state were replaced by more localised arrangements that probably worked less well for most people. Archaeological evidence suggests some economic decline during this period, though nothing catastrophic. Egypt's agricultural wealth provided a floor below which standards of living couldn't easily fall. The military developments of the period are particularly important for understanding what came next. The Libyan system of decentralised military commands, each loyal primarily to its local commander rather than to the pharaoh, created both problems and opportunities. The problems are obvious. Without unified military command, Egypt couldn't effectively respond to external threats. The opportunities were less obvious but equally significant. When a strong ruler did emerge who could unify these scattered forces, he would command a substantial military establishment that had been maintained and developed at local expense. This is exactly what the Nubians would exploit when they came north. They found not a defenceless Egypt, but an Egypt whose military resources had been preserved even as its political unity had shattered. The transition from Libyan to Nubian rule would be more gradual and complex than simple invasion narratives might suggest. The Nubians had been building influence in Upper Egypt for decades before they formally claimed the throne. Theban priests, frustrated with Libyan chaos, had been developing relationships with Nubian rulers who shared their devotion to Amun. By the time the Nubians marched north in force, they already had allies, supporters and collaborators among the Egyptian elite. The conquest, when it came, was as much invitation as invasion, or at least that's how the Nubian rulers chose to portray it. But the Libyans weren't finished yet. Even after the Nubians established themselves as the legitimate pharaohs, Libyan rulers continued to control parts of the delta, sometimes acknowledging Nubian supremacy, sometimes asserting independence. The political landscape of Egypt in the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE was extraordinarily complex, with Nubian pharaohs, Libyan kings, Theban priests, and various local powers all competing for authority and resources. This complexity would have significant consequences when Assyria turned its attention toward Egypt, finding a divided land that could be conquered piece by piece rather than confronted as a unified state. The Libyan period thus ends not with a bang, but with a gradual dissolution, as Libyan authority faded in the face of Nubian ambition and Assyrian aggression. The 22nd dynasty gave way to the 23rd and 24th, each representing further fragmentation of what had been an already fragmented realm. The pharaonic titles continued to be used, the traditional rituals continued to be performed, but the content behind these forms became increasingly thin. By the time the Nubians completed their conquest of Egypt, the Libyans had been ruling, and misruling, for over 2 centuries, a period that saw Egyptian civilization continue but not flourish, survive but not thrive. The social dynamics of Libyan Egypt reveal much about how conquered populations adapt to foreign rule. Ordinary Egyptians, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, minor priests, had to navigate a world where the people at the top looked different, spoke with accents, and organised their power in unfamiliar ways. The evidence suggests that most Egyptians simply got on with their lives, paying taxes to whoever demanded them, worshipping their gods in their local temples, and leaving the high politics to the elites who seemed to enjoy fighting over such things. This practical accommodation wasn't enthusiasm, it was survival, the same strategy that peasant populations have employed throughout history when powerful people decide to argue over who gets to rule them. The intermarriage between Libyan and Egyptian families created a complex social hierarchy that defied simple ethnic categorization. By the later centuries of Libyan rule, many prominent families had mixed ancestry, combining Libyan military traditions with Egyptian priestly or administrative lineages. These hybrid elites developed their own subculture, neither purely Libyan nor purely Egyptian, but something new that combined elements of both. They spoke Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, and participated in Egyptian ceremonies, but they also maintained Libyan family structures, naming conventions and certain social customs. This cultural blending was probably more significant for the long-term development of Egyptian society than the political chaos happening at higher levels. The position of women during the Libyan period deserves mention, partly because it illustrates the contradictions of the era. Traditional Egyptian society had given women relatively high status compared to other ancient cultures. Women could own property, conduct business, and participate in religious ceremonies in ways that would have been unthinkable in Greece or Mesopotamia. Libyan tribal society had its own traditions regarding women, including prominent roles for powerful women in family and clan politics. The combination produced some interesting results. Libyan-era Egypt saw influential women operating in both religious and political spheres, sometimes wielding considerable power behind the scenes, even when official positions remained male-dominated. The divine wives of Amun, a position that became increasingly important during this period, illustrate this dynamic nicely. These women, usually princesses from the royal family, held positions of enormous religious prestige at Thebes, effectively controlling the wealth and resources of the Amun cult. Over time, the divine wives accumulated so much power that they became political figures in their own right, sometimes more influential than the nominally ruling pharaohs. The institution survived into subsequent periods and provides one of the few examples of formal female authority in ancient Egyptian governance. That this development occurred during the chaotic Libyan period, when central authority was weak and creative adaptations were necessary for survival, probably isn't coincidental. The technological and agricultural developments of the Libyan period are difficult to assess due to limited evidence, but some changes are apparent. Iron tools began to become more common during this era, though Egypt remained behind other Mediterranean cultures in adopting iron technology. The conservative nature of Egyptian society, combined with the political fragmentation that disrupted large-scale coordination, meant that technological innovations spread slowly and unevenly. Some regions adopted new techniques while others continued traditional practices. The lack of central planning meant that improvements weren't systematically implemented across the kingdom. The irrigation systems that made Egyptian agriculture possible required ongoing maintenance and occasional expansion, work that had traditionally been organised by the central government. Under Libyan rule, this responsibility devolved increasingly to local authorities, with varying results. Some areas maintained their systems effectively, others saw gradual deterioration, as the coordination necessary for major projects became harder to achieve. The agricultural output of Egypt remained high by absolute standards. The Nile's annual flood provided a natural fertilization system that no political chaos could entirely disrupt. But the efficiency with which this output was collected, stored and distributed probably declined. The religious festivals that punctuated Egyptian life continued throughout the Libyan period, though perhaps with modifications reflecting changed circumstances. These festivals were enormously important for social cohesion, bringing communities together for celebrations that reinforced shared identity and provided welcome breaks from agricultural labour. The festivals also had economic dimensions, with markets and trade occurring alongside religious ceremonies. Local temples organised these events, and their continuation even during political fragmentation suggests that the institutional infrastructure of Egyptian religion remained largely intact even when political structures were crumbling. The funerary practices of ordinary Egyptians during this period show interesting adaptations to changed circumstances. Elite burials became more modest as resources were diverted to political competition rather than afterlife preparation. Some families economised by reusing tomb spaces, adding new burials to chambers that had been prepared for ancestors. Not exactly what Egyptian tradition prescribed, but pragmatic given the circumstances. The democratisation of afterlife beliefs that had been developing since the New Kingdom continued, with more people claiming access to the resurrection spells and protective magic that had once been royal prerogatives. If the pharaohs couldn't guarantee cosmic order, perhaps individuals could ensure their own eternal salvation through proper preparation and correct ritual. The scribal tradition, that cornerstone of Egyptian administrative and cultural life, faced particular challenges during the Libyan period. Scribal schools required stable institutions to function, temples or government offices that could train new generations, maintain libraries of model texts, and provide employment for graduates. As institutions fragmented, so did the scribal network, with different centres developing their own variations in training and practice. The result was a gradual divergence of scribal traditions across Egypt, with regional variations in handwriting styles, textual conventions, and administrative practices. This diversification would have implications for later periods, when attempts to restore centralised government would require reconciling these variant traditions. The foreign communities resident in Egypt during the Libyan period added another layer of complexity to an already complex society. Greeks had been present in Egypt since at least the 7th century BCE, when they established trading posts in the delta with pharaonic permission. Phoenician merchants operated throughout the Mediterranean, and Egypt remained an important node in their commercial networks. Assyrians, Babylonians, and various peoples from the Levant maintained connections with Egypt for diplomatic and commercial purposes. These foreign residents brought their own customs, languages, and religions, creating cosmopolitan enclaves in major Egyptian cities that would grow even more significant in later periods. The military technology of the Libyan period reflected broader trends in ancient Near Eastern warfare. Cavalry was becoming increasingly important, and Libyan forces included mounted troops alongside the traditional chariotry and infantry. Iron weapons were gradually replacing bronze, though the transition was slower in Egypt than in some other regions. The organisation of armies remained largely based on ethnic and tribal units, with Libyan commanders leading Libyan troops while Egyptian units served under their own officers. This organisation enhanced the fragmentation problem. Armies were loyal to their commanders rather than to abstract concepts like state or nation, and commanders were loyal primarily to their own advancement. The lesson of the Libyan period is perhaps this: cultural adoption is not enough. The Libyans did almost everything right in terms of cultural assimilation. They learned the language, adopted the religion, used the symbols, performed the rituals. They became Egyptian in every meaningful cultural sense. But they couldn't become Egyptian in the political sense, couldn't create the unified, effective state that Egyptian ideology demanded and Egyptian prosperity required. They wore the costume but couldn't play the part, and their rule demonstrated that there's more to ruling a civilization than looking like you belong there. This failure was not primarily one of character or ability. The Libyan pharaohs included competent and ambitious individuals. It was a failure of system, of political organisation, of the underlying structures that made effective governance possible. The Libyans imported their tribal politics into Egypt, and those politics proved incompatible with pharaonic rule. You can't run a centralised state through decentralised networks of family loyalty, and the Libyans never figured out an alternative. Their legacy is thus a cautionary tale about the limits of cultural transformation, a reminder that adopting a civilization's symbols is easier than inheriting its substance. Egypt would survive this period, as it had survived earlier crises and would survive later ones. The Nile still flooded, the temples still stood, the traditions still shaped how people understood their world. But the Egypt that emerged from Libyan rule was a changed Egypt, one that had grown accustomed to foreign rulers and internal division, one that would spend the rest of its ancient history trying to recapture a unity and glory that seemed to recede further with each passing century. The Libyans hadn't killed Egyptian civilization, but they had weakened it, and the weakness would prove difficult to overcome. If you wanted to design a political system guaranteed to produce dysfunction, you could hardly do better than what Egypt developed during the centuries following the New Kingdom. Imagine taking a country that had been unified for millennia under absolute divine monarchy and splitting it between two entirely different types of authority: military strongmen in one region, religious leaders in another, with neither side willing to submit to the other, but both claiming to represent legitimate Egyptian tradition. Now add the complication that both sides needed each other for different purposes, couldn't quite conquer each other, and couldn't quite cooperate either. What you get is a recipe for paralysis, and paralysis is exactly what Egypt experienced during the long centuries of the Third Intermediate Period. The North-South divide that characterised this era wasn't simply geographic, it was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of what Egyptian authority should look like. In the north, centred in the delta cities of Tanis, Bubastis and later Sais, power was held by military commanders, most of them of Libyan descent, who understood authority in terms of armed force, personal loyalty and territorial control. These were practical men, warriors and administrators who maintained their positions through a combination of military capability and political manoeuvring. They wore the pharaonic titles and performed the royal rituals, but their power ultimately rested on the soldiers who followed them and the resources they could command. In the south, centred on the ancient religious capital of Thebes, power belonged to the priests of Amun, the king of the gods. These weren't military men, but religious specialists, inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to the heights of the New Kingdom, when Amun's temple at Karnak had been the wealthiest religious institution in the ancient world. The high priests of Amun claimed authority not through military force, but through their unique relationship with the god himself. They interpreted his oracles, performed his rituals, and administered his vast temple estates. In their view, legitimate authority came from divine sanction, not from the point of a spear. The tension between these two sources of legitimacy created a political standoff that would last for centuries. The northern pharaohs needed the religious sanction that only the Theban priesthood could provide. Without it, they were just foreign warlords with fancy titles. The Theban priests, meanwhile, needed the military protection and political recognition that the northern pharaohs could offer. Without it, they were just wealthy clergy vulnerable to anyone who decided to help themselves to temple treasures. Neither side could dominate the other, so they developed an uneasy coexistence that satisfied no one but somehow persisted generation after generation. The practical arrangements that emerged from this standoff were remarkably complex. The high priests of Amun began adding royal titles to their names, inscribing their cartouches in the manner of kings, and dating documents by their own regnal years as if they were independent monarchs. The northern pharaohs in turn tried to place their relatives in the Theban priesthood, hoping to bring this power centre under family control. Sometimes this worked. More often, the installed relatives developed their own local interests and became as independent as the priests they had replaced. The result was a web of competing claims, overlapping authorities, and contradictory legitimacies that would give any constitutional lawyer a headache. Consider the position of a provincial administrator trying to navigate this system. To whom did you owe loyalty? The pharaoh in the Delta, who held the traditional royal titles but whose actual power might not extend to your province. The high priest in Thebes, who commanded enormous local resources and the backing of the god Amun but wasn't technically the king. Your local military commander, who might be a relative of the pharaoh, a supporter of the priests, or an ambitious independent playing both sides against each other. The practical answer was usually whoever is closest with the most soldiers, which made a mockery of the elaborate hierarchical theories that Egyptian political culture had developed over millennia. The divine wives of Amun complicated this picture further. These royal women, installed at Thebes as symbolic brides of the god, accumulated political and economic power that rivaled or exceeded that of the high priests themselves. They controlled temple estates, commanded loyalty from religious personnel, and exercised authority that was theoretically derived from their sacred marriage to Amun rather than from any male lineage. The institution became a political tool. Northern pharaohs would install their daughters as divine wives to extend their influence into the south, but once installed, these women often developed their own agendas that didn't necessarily align with their father's interests. The economic dimensions of this north-south split deserve careful attention. The temple estates of Amun at Thebes were enormous. Some estimates suggest they controlled up to 30% of Egyptian agricultural land at their peak. This land wasn't taxed by secular authorities. Its produce supported the temple cult, its personnel, and its various charitable functions. The priests who administered these estates were effectively running a parallel economy, one that operated according to religious rather than political logic. When the central government was strong, this parallel economy could be coordinated with national interests. When the central government was weak, as it was throughout most of the Third Intermediate Period, the temple economy became an independent power base that could support political autonomy. The northern delta region, by contrast, was the commercial heart of Egypt, connected to Mediterranean trade routes that brought wealth from Greece, Phoenicia, and beyond. The Libyan rulers who controlled this region derived their resources from trade, agriculture, and military tribute rather than from temple estates. Their economy was more dynamic and externally oriented, but also more dependent on maintaining security along trade routes and in port cities. When political fragmentation disrupted these networks, northern revenues suffered in ways that southern temple income did not. This economic divergence had military implications. The south could maintain its position through the passive resources of temple estates, land that produced regardless of political conditions, peasants who farmed regardless of who claimed to rule them. The north needed active management, constant attention to commercial relationships and military threats. Northern rulers were therefore more aggressive in their political manoeuvring, more likely to launch military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives, more engaged with the wider Mediterranean world. Southern priests could afford to be more conservative, more focused on maintaining traditional practices, more content with the status quo that preserved their comfortable position. The religious ideology that justified priestly power developed distinctive features during this period. The cult of Amun emphasized oracular revelation. The god spoke through his cult statue, answering questions and providing guidance on matters ranging from personal problems to affairs of state. These oracular sessions were theatrical events, with the god's statue carried in procession, while priests interpreted its movements as divine communication. Naturally, the interpretations tended to favor priestly interests, a coincidence that skeptics might find suspicious, but that believers accepted as evidence of Amun's wisdom and justice. The oracle system gave the Theban priests enormous political leverage. Major decisions could be referred to the god for approval, and since the priests controlled the interpretation of oracular responses, they effectively had veto power over policies they disliked. Northern pharaohs who wanted to pursue initiatives in the south had to either work with the priesthood or risk being condemned by divine will, not a comfortable position for rulers who claimed to be gods themselves. This oracular authority became a check on military power, a religious counterbalance to armed force that gave the priests influence far beyond what their military capabilities would have supported. The architecture of the period reflects these competing power centres. In the north, the Libyan pharaohs built at Tanis, creating a new royal capital with temples, tombs and monuments that imitated the great constructions of earlier ages. The Tanis Temple of Amun was partly built with blocks and statues taken from the abandoned city of Pyrameses, earlier materials repurposed for new propaganda needs. This recycling was practical. Why quarry new stone when perfectly good blocks were lying around? But it also symbolised the relationship between Libyan rule and Egyptian tradition. The new rulers were building with the pieces of the old civilization, constructing something that looked traditional but was assembled from fragments of a broken whole. In the south, the Theban priests continued to maintain and expand the Karnak temple complex, adding new constructions that emphasized their own authority and piety. These additions were often smaller and less ambitious than the great New Kingdom projects, reflecting reduced resources and perhaps reduced confidence, but they kept the tradition alive. The message was clear. Thebes remained the religious heart of Egypt, the place where divine power manifested most clearly, regardless of what military adventures were happening in the distant delta. The military organization of divided Egypt reflected its political fragmentation. There was no unified Egyptian army during this period. Instead, there were multiple military forces loyal to different commanders and power centers. The northern pharaohs commanded the largest forces, based on the Libyan military traditions that had brought them to power, but their control over these forces was often tenuous. Individual commanders controlled their own troops, maintained their own territories, and could switch allegiances if better offers came along. The south had fewer dedicated military forces. The priests relied on divine authority rather than armed might, but could call upon local levies and the soldiers of allied commanders when necessary. This military fragmentation made coordinated defence against external threats essentially impossible. When enemies appeared on Egypt's borders, there was no unified command structure to organise resistance, no single authority that could mobilise national resources for defence. Different power centres made their own calculations about whether to fight, negotiate, or simply stay out of the way and let someone else deal with the problem. This was not, to put it mildly, an optimal strategy for national survival, but it was the natural consequence of the political system that had evolved. The diplomatic relations of divided Egypt were correspondingly complex. Foreign powers found themselves dealing not with a single Egyptian government, but with multiple competing authorities, each claiming legitimacy and each pursuing its own interests. This could be exploited by clever foreign diplomats who played different Egyptian factions against each other, promising support to one while negotiating with another. The Assyrians, in particular, would prove adept at this strategy when they turned their attention to Egypt, finding willing collaborators among Egyptian rulers who saw foreign alliance as a way to gain advantage over domestic rivals. The cultural production of the divided period shows interesting patterns of both continuity and innovation. Religious texts continued to be composed and copied, maintaining the literary traditions that defined Egyptian intellectual life. Funerary practices evolved as different regions developed their own variations on traditional themes. Artistic styles became more diverse as the centralized training systems of earlier periods broke down, with different workshops developing distinctive approaches within the broad framework of Egyptian tradition. One notable development was the increasing use of bronze statuettes for religious purposes. Earlier periods had favoured stone sculpture for divine images, but the Third Intermediate Period saw a proliferation of small bronze figures depicting gods, kings, and sacred animals. These objects were often dedicated in temples by private individuals, reflecting the democratization of religious practice that accompanied the weakening of royal control over cult activities. Ordinary Egyptians, unable to rely on the pharaoh's cosmic maintenance of divine order, took matters into their own hands, dedicating offerings and commissioning ritual objects that would ensure their personal relationship with the gods. The scribal tradition fractured along with political authority. Different power centres maintained their own scribal schools, training bureaucrats and priests in the skills necessary for administration and religious practice. The hieroglyphic writing system remained unified. It was too complex to diverge significantly in just a few centuries, but administrative practices, textual formats, and educational curricula developed regional variations. A scribe trained in Thebes might find Delta administrative practices unfamiliar, and vice versa. This diversification was both symptom and cause of political fragmentation, making coordination across regional boundaries more difficult even when political will existed. The treatment of royal tombs during this period illustrates the changed relationship between pharaohs and their eternal afterlife. The Libyan kings at Tanis were buried within temple precincts rather than in isolated valley tombs, a significant departure from New Kingdom practice. These burials were elaborate and expensive, filled with gold and silver grave goods that demonstrated royal wealth and piety, but they were also more modest than the great royal tombs of earlier ages. The careful separation between royal tombs and populated areas that had characterized earlier burial practices was abandoned, perhaps because the ideology of sacred kingship had been weakened to the point where such elaborate precautions seemed unnecessary. The Theban priests, meanwhile, took responsibility for maintaining and protecting the royal mummies that had been buried in the Valley of the Kings during earlier dynasties. Faced with systematic tomb robbery that they seemed unable to prevent, the priests eventually gathered the mummies of great pharaohs from their violated tombs and reburied them in secret caches, hoping to preserve the royal dead even if their treasure couldn't be protected. These caches, discovered in the 19th and 20th centuries, preserved the mummies of New Kingdom rulers like Rameses II and provided invaluable evidence for understanding ancient Egyptian burial practices. But their creation was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that the traditional system of royal burial had broken down irreparably. The psychological impact of political fragmentation on Egyptian identity deserves consideration. For millennia, Egyptians had understood their country as a unified whole. The two lands joined under the rule of a single divine king who maintained cosmic order through his performance of ritual duties. This ideology was inscribed in every temple, embodied in every royal title, assumed in every official text. But reality no longer matched ideology. The two lands were genuinely two again, divided between competing authorities who couldn't even agree on who was legitimately pharaoh. The cosmic order that the king was supposed to maintain seemed distinctly disordered. How did ordinary Egyptians process this cognitive dissonance? The evidence suggests a turn toward more personal and local forms of religious practice, focusing on direct relationships with gods rather than on the cosmic functions of kingship. People prayed to household deities, consulted local oracles, participated in community festivals, practices that didn't depend on having a legitimate pharaoh in Memphis or Thebes. Egyptian religion proved adaptable enough to survive the weakening of its royal dimension, finding new forms of expression that didn't require a functioning divine monarchy. The institution of the god's wife of Amun became particularly important during this period, partly because it offered a form of religious authority that was separate from both military power and the high priesthood. These women, who took vows of celibacy and devoted themselves entirely to the service of Amun, represented a third pole of power in the divided political landscape. Their position was theoretically religious but practically political, and their wealth and influence made them essential players in any attempt to govern Upper Egypt. Northern pharaohs used the institution to extend their influence southward, while southern interests used it to maintain autonomy from northern control. The succession of divine wives was carefully managed to serve political purposes. When one divine wife died or retired, her successor was typically adopted from the northern royal family, establishing a family connection that linked the Delta pharaohs to the Theban religious establishment. But once installed, the new divine wife became part of the southern power structure, her interests aligning more with local concerns than with the policies of her northern relatives. The institution thus served as both a bridge and a barrier between north and south, a point of connection that nevertheless preserved southern independence. The economic management of temple estates during this period developed distinctive features that would influence later Egyptian history. The priests who administered these estates became increasingly sophisticated in their financial practices, developing accounting systems, managing labour forces, and coordinating agricultural production across vast holdings. These administrative skills would prove valuable when stronger rulers eventually attempted to reunify Egypt. The temple bureaucracy provided institutional capacity that could be repurposed for state administration. But in the meantime, these skills served the interests of priestly independence rather than national unity. The foreign communities in Egypt navigated the divided political landscape with varying degrees of success. Greek merchants who had established trading posts in the Delta during this period found the fragmented political situation both challenging and profitable. Challenging because security was uncertain and multiple authorities demanded tribute or taxes. Profitable because competition among Egyptian rulers created opportunities for favourable trade agreements and special privileges. The Greeks learned to play Egyptian factions against each other, supporting different rulers as circumstances dictated and extracting commercial advantages from the political chaos. The military technology of the period continued to evolve, though Egypt lagged behind developments in other parts of the Near East. Iron weapons became more common, cavalry tactics more sophisticated, siege warfare more effective. But these developments occurred elsewhere, in Assyria, in the rising Greek city-states, in the Nubian kingdom to the south, and Egypt's fragmented political system made it difficult to adopt and implement military innovations. Each regional commander had his own forces, his own equipment, his own tactical preferences, and there was no central authority to impose standardization or modernization. This military backwardness would have serious consequences when Egypt faced enemies who had kept pace with technological change. The Assyrians, in particular, had developed the most advanced military machine in the ancient world. Professional armies equipped with iron weapons, sophisticated siege equipment, and cavalry tactics that Egyptian forces couldn't match. When Assyria eventually turned its attention to Egypt, the technical superiority of the invaders would be overwhelming. The diplomatic isolation of divided Egypt was another consequence of fragmentation. A unified Egypt had been a major player in the international system, corresponding with great powers, mediating disputes, and projecting influence across the eastern Mediterranean. Divided Egypt was a regional power at best, unable to sustain the diplomatic presence that international influence required. Other powers noticed this weakness and adjusted their calculations accordingly. Egypt was no longer a great power to be courted and respected. It was becoming a prize to be won, a rich land whose wealth could be captured by anyone strong enough to take it. The Nubian kingdom of Kush, watching this dysfunction from its position to the south, drew conclusions that would soon reshape Egyptian history. The Kushites had been Egyptian subjects during the New Kingdom, their elites thoroughly Egyptianized through centuries of colonial rule. They had adopted Egyptian gods, Egyptian writing, Egyptian artistic styles, and Egyptian concepts of kingship. But they had also developed their own state institutions, their own military capabilities, and their own ambitions. When they looked north at divided Egypt, they saw not an opportunity for mere conquest, but an opportunity for restoration. a chance to reunify the land of the Nile under proper pharaonic rule, with themselves as the proper pharaohs. The irony of this situation was exquisite. Egypt, which had spent centuries conquering and colonizing Nubia, imposing Egyptian culture on subject peoples, was about to be saved by those very subjects, who had absorbed Egyptian culture so thoroughly that they believed themselves better qualified to rule Egypt than the Egyptians themselves. The colonized had become the colonizers, the students had become the teachers, and the Nubians were preparing to show the Egyptians how Egyptian kingship was properly done. But before the Nubians could complete their intervention, Egypt's fragmentation would reach its ultimate expression in a period of multiple simultaneous pharaohs, competing dynasties, and political chaos that made even the earlier centuries of division look orderly by comparison. The 22nd dynasty gave way to the 23rd and 24th, each representing a further fracturing of already fragmented authority. At one point, there may have been as many as 5 or 6 individuals claiming pharaonic titles in different parts of Egypt, each controlling a small territory, and each pretending that the others didn't exist. This political atomization was the final stage before foreign intervention became inevitable. No Egyptian faction was strong enough to reunify the country on its own, but each was strong enough to prevent others from doing so. The result was a perpetual standoff, a balance of weakness rather than strength that paralyzed the entire system. Egypt had talked itself into a corner from which it couldn't escape without outside assistance or outside conquest. The religious dimension of this crisis took on apocalyptic overtones in some texts of the period. Prophecies and laments described Egypt's troubled condition as punishment for impiety, suggesting that the gods had withdrawn their favour because of human failures. These texts looked forward to a future restoration, when a righteous king would arise to reunify the land and restore proper worship. Such prophecies were politically useful. Any ruler who managed to achieve reunification could claim to be fulfilling divine destiny. But they also reflected genuine religious anxiety about Egypt's condition. The priests of Amun at Thebes particularly cultivated this prophetic tradition, emphasizing their unique relationship with the god and their role as interpreters of divine will. In their telling, Egypt's problems stemmed from the impiety of northern rulers who had neglected proper worship and allowed sacred traditions to decay. The solution was obvious: restore proper reverence for Amun, support his priesthood, and follow the guidance of his oracles. That this solution conveniently served priestly interests was, they assured everyone, entirely coincidental. The culmination of this political and religious crisis came in the mid-8th century BCE, when the Nubian king Pa decided that he had seen enough. Marching north with his armies, proclaiming himself the true servant of Amun and the rightful restorer of Egyptian order, Pa would conquer the entire land of the Nile and establish the 25th dynasty. But his success was only possible because the divided Egypt of priests and generals had weakened itself to the point where outside intervention became irresistible. The internal conflicts that had paralysed Egyptian politics for centuries had finally created an opening that outsiders could exploit. The legacy of divided Egypt was thus a cautionary tale about the dangers of political fragmentation. The competition between priests and generals, between north and south, between religious authority and military power, had prevented any single faction from dominating, but it had also prevented any faction from governing effectively. Egypt had preserved its traditions, maintained its religious institutions, continued its cultural practices, but it had lost the political coherence that made national survival possible. The land of the Nile had become a battlefield where Egyptian factions fought each other rather than external threats, and this internal conflict invited exactly the foreign intervention that all factions feared. The priests who thought divine authority would protect them, the generals who thought military force would secure them, the local rulers who thought their small kingdoms could survive amid larger conflicts. All of them were about to discover that their calculations had been wrong. The Nubians were coming, and after the Nubians, the Assyrians, and after the Assyrians, the Persians. Egypt's long twilight was about to enter a new phase, one where foreign rule would become the norm rather than the exception, and where the question would no longer be whether Egypt could maintain independence, but whether it could maintain its identity under foreign domination. The division of power between priests and generals that had characterized the Third Intermediate Period was about to be resolved, not through Egyptian victory of one faction over another, but through the imposition of external order by rulers who claimed Egyptian legitimacy while coming from beyond Egypt's borders. The pattern established during these divided centuries would shape Egyptian history for the rest of the ancient period. Foreign rulers claiming pharaonic titles, Egyptian institutions adapting to foreign management, and Egyptian culture persisting through political changes that would have destroyed less resilient civilizations. The tragedy of divided Egypt was that its very strength contributed to its weakness. The power of Egyptian religious institutions, which preserved ancient traditions and provided continuity through political chaos, also created an alternative power centre that prevented political unification. The military capabilities of Libyan commanders, which protected Egyptian territories from some external threats, also fragmented the country into competing warlord domains. The cultural prestige that made everyone want to be pharaoh also made it impossible for anyone to accept someone else's claim to that title. Egypt was too rich to ignore, too sophisticated to abandon, and too divided to defend. The Nubians who would soon march north understood this perfectly. They weren't coming as barbarian invaders to destroy Egyptian civilization. They were coming as devotees of Egyptian culture to save it from itself. Their conquest would be presented as restoration, their rule as return to ancient standards that Egyptians had abandoned. And remarkably, many Egyptians would accept this interpretation, welcoming Nubian rule as a relief from the chaos of divided government. The priests of Amun, in particular, would find the Nubians more congenial rulers than the Libyan pharaohs had ever been, fellow worshippers of the god, respectful of priestly prerogatives, committed to traditional practices that the northern rulers had neglected. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, let's simply note where things stood as the Third Intermediate Period reached its crisis point. A country divided against itself, a political system that produced paralysis instead of governance, and a cultural tradition that everyone claimed to revere but no one could effectively maintain. Egypt had become a prize waiting to be claimed, and the claimants were already sharpening their weapons. The land of the Nile, which had once been the greatest power in the ancient world, was about to discover what it felt like to be conquered, not once but repeatedly, as wave after wave of foreign rulers would impose their authority on the weakened kingdom. The division of power between priests and generals wasn't resolved through compromise or reconciliation. It was resolved by the arrival of outsiders who were stronger than either faction, and who used Egypt's internal divisions to establish their own control. This pattern, foreign rulers exploiting Egyptian fragmentation, would recur throughout the remaining centuries of ancient Egyptian history, from the Nubians through the Persians to Alexander and the Ptolemies. The priests and generals of the Third Intermediate Period had created the template for Egypt's future, a rich, cultured, divided land that foreign powers would compete to control. The administrative chaos of divided Egypt created opportunities for social mobility that would have been unthinkable in earlier, more rigidly hierarchical periods. When central authority was strong, positions were inherited, careers were predictable, and movement between social classes was rare. When central authority collapsed, ambitious individuals could exploit the confusion to advance themselves. A talented scribe might attach himself to a rising military commander, a successful merchant might purchase influence with competing rulers, a clever priest might maneuver between factions to accumulate power that his official position wouldn't normally command. This social fluidity had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it prevented the complete ossification of Egyptian society, allowing new blood and new ideas to enter elite circles. On the negative side, it destabilized the institutions that held society together, replacing predictable hierarchies with unpredictable competition. The security that people had once derived from knowing their place in a stable system was replaced by the anxiety of constant political uncertainty. Nobody knew which faction would be on top next year, which commander would be the new power broker, which political alignment would prove advantageous or fatal. The legal system of divided Egypt struggled to function across jurisdictional boundaries. Egyptian law had traditionally been royal law, administered by officials who derived their authority from the pharaoh and applied consistent principles across the kingdom. When there were multiple pharaohs, each claiming supreme authority, the legal system fragmented accordingly. A contract made under the authority of one ruler might not be enforceable in territories controlled by another. Property disputes that crossed regional boundaries became nearly impossible to resolve. The predictability that legal systems require for effective functioning was undermined by political chaos. Temple courts became increasingly important during this period. partly because they offered a form of legal authority that transcended political boundaries. The god's judgment, delivered through oracular pronouncement, could theoretically apply anywhere. It didn't depend on which human ruler happened to control a given territory. People brought their disputes to temple courts not just for religious reasons, but for practical ones. A divine judgment might be respected where a royal decree would be ignored. The priests who administered these courts gained additional influence as mediators and arbiters, their judicial role complementing their religious and economic functions. The succession crises that plagued divided Egypt were particularly destabilizing because there was no agreed-upon mechanism for resolving disputed claims. In theory, the pharaoh was chosen by the gods and confirmed by proper ritual. In practice, the pharaoh was whoever could grab power and hold on to it. This made every succession a potential crisis, as multiple candidates advanced competing claims and factions mobilized to support their preferred contender. The Libyan system of distributing power among family members made this problem worse, since every royal relative was a potential rival with his own power base and his own ambitions. The problem of military loyalty became acute in this fragmented political environment. Soldiers followed commanders, not abstract concepts like nation or dynasty. When a commander died or was overthrown, his soldiers might transfer their loyalty to his successor, might scatter to seek employment elsewhere, or might simply turn to banditry if no better options presented themselves. The Egyptian countryside during periods of particularly acute instability was plagued by bands of former soldiers, armed men without masters who supported themselves through robbery and intimidation. This was not exactly conducive to agricultural productivity or commercial prosperity. The religious festivals that had once unified Egyptian society became more localized during the divided period. Major festivals at Thebes or Memphis still attracted pilgrims from across Egypt, but the coordination that had characterized earlier celebrations was difficult to maintain when political authority was fragmented. Local festivals became more important, celebrations organized by regional temples that served regional populations. This localization strengthened community bonds within regions but weakened the connections that had linked regions together. Egypt was becoming a collection of local societies rather than a single national community. The treatment of foreign residents in Egypt varied considerably, depending on which faction controlled a given area. Some Libyan rulers were relatively welcoming to Greek merchants and other foreign traders, recognizing the economic benefits they brought. The Theban priests were more conservative, preferring to maintain traditional Egyptian practices and viewing foreign influence with suspicion. This differential treatment created incentives for foreign communities to align with particular Egyptian factions, adding another layer of complexity to an already chaotic political situation. The intellectual life of divided Egypt showed signs of both continuity and decline. Scribal schools continued to operate, training new generations in the skills of reading, writing, and administration. Temple libraries preserved ancient texts and continued to copy them for ritual and educational purposes. But the innovative intellectual work that had characterized earlier periods, new religious compositions, new literary forms, new scientific investigations, became rarer. Energy that might have gone into creative work was absorbed by the demands of navigating a fragmented political landscape. Survival took precedence over innovation. The artistic production of the divided periods similarly showed a mix of persistence and deterioration. Workshops continued to produce sculpture, jewellery, and other luxury goods for elite patrons. Some of this work was of high quality, demonstrating that technical skills had been preserved even amid political chaos. But the scale of production declined, and the ambitious projects that had characterized earlier periods, massive temple constructions, elaborate royal tombs, monumental sculpture, became rare. The resources and coordination required for such projects were simply not available in a fragmented political system. The position of ordinary Egyptians during this period of elite conflict remains somewhat obscure, since the surviving evidence overwhelmingly reflects elite perspectives and concerns. But we can infer some things about peasant life during the divided centuries. Agricultural work continued much as it always had. The Nile still flooded, crops still needed planting and harvesting, and peasant labour still produced the food that supported Egyptian civilization. The ownership of agricultural land might change as different elites rose and fell, but the fundamental rhythms of peasant life probably remained relatively stable. What did change was the burden of taxation and labour demands that peasants faced. With multiple authorities claiming legitimacy, peasants might find themselves being taxed by different rulers, each claiming a share of agricultural production. The administrative chaos of the period probably made tax collection more erratic but not necessarily lighter. Each local authority had incentives to extract as much as possible from the peasants under its control, since it couldn't count on receiving resources from elsewhere. The lot of the ordinary Egyptian during the divided period was probably not enviable, caught between competing powers that treated them as resources to be exploited rather than citizens to be governed. The urban populations of major cities like Thebes, Memphis, and the Delta trading centres experienced the divided period differently from rural peasants. Cities were centres of political competition, places where factions clashed and alliances shifted. Urban residents had more opportunity to participate in political life, attaching themselves to particular patrons or factions, but they also faced greater risks when political winds changed. The destruction of a city during factional fighting, or simply the economic disruption caused by political instability, could devastate urban populations in ways that more dispersed rural communities might avoid. The relationship between the Egyptian population and their Libyan rulers evolved over the course of the divided period. Initial resentment of foreign conquest probably faded over generations as intermarriage blurred ethnic boundaries and Libyan families became thoroughly Egyptianized. But distinctions persisted in some contexts. Military units still organized along ethnic lines, certain titles and offices still associated with Libyan or Egyptian backgrounds. This ethnic dimension added another layer to the factional politics of the period, though it was probably less important than family connections and regional allegiances. The infrastructure of Egypt, canals, roads, granaries, and administrative buildings deteriorated during the divided period due to lack of coordinated maintenance. Building new infrastructure required resources and organisation that the fragmented political system couldn't provide. Maintaining existing infrastructure was neglected as attention focused on more immediate political and military concerns. This deterioration had long-term consequences for Egyptian prosperity, making agriculture less efficient, trade more difficult, and administration more cumbersome. The divided period was not just politically chaotic, it was also a period of physical decline as the country's infrastructure slowly decayed. The military tactics of the divided period evolved in response to the fragmented political situation. Large-scale set-piece battles became rare, since no single faction commanded forces large enough for decisive engagement. Instead, warfare consisted of raids, sieges, and small-scale skirmishes designed to weaken rivals without risking catastrophic defeat. This style of warfare was less destructive than full-scale campaigns, but also less decisive, contributing to the political stalemate that characterized the period. No one could win, but no one would give up, so the conflict continued indefinitely at a slow simmer. The psychological toll of perpetual political uncertainty on Egyptian elites must have been considerable. These were people raised with expectations of orderly succession, stable institutions, and predictable careers. Instead, they found themselves navigating a chaotic landscape where alliances shifted constantly, where yesterday's patron might become tomorrow's enemy, where political miscalculation could mean the end of a family's fortunes. Some adapted by becoming cynical political operators, skilled at reading factional alignments and adjusting their positions accordingly. Others retreated from political involvement, focusing on religious devotion or private pursuits that seemed more stable than public life. The diplomatic communications of divided Egypt reveal the reduced status of Egyptian rulers in the international system. Letters that survive from this period show Egyptian pharaohs addressing foreign kings as equals or even superiors, a dramatic change from the New Kingdom when Egyptian rulers had expected deference from virtually everyone. The great powers of the era, Assyria, Babylon, the rising Greek city-states, no longer saw Egypt as a peer but as a potential target, a rich land whose wealth could be captured if sufficient force was applied. This changed perception would have serious consequences when Assyria eventually decided that the time had come to bring Egypt under its control. The religious innovations of the divided period, though less dramatic than those of earlier eras, deserve attention. The cult of sacred animals expanded significantly during this time, with temples dedicated to bulls, cats, ibises, and other creatures receiving increased devotion. This animal worship, which would strike later Greek visitors as peculiar and barbaric, represented a democratization of religious practice. Ordinary people could interact directly with divine creatures without the mediation of pharaonic ritual. The breeding, care, and burial of sacred animals became major religious industries, employing thousands of people and generating significant economic activity. The practice of dedicating bronze votive figures also expanded during the divided period. People commissioned small statues of gods, sacred animals, or themselves to be placed in temples as permanent offerings. These bronzes, produced in huge quantities, document the religious concerns of ordinary Egyptians in ways that more elite sources do not. People prayed for health, fertility, success in business, protection from enemies, the universal concerns of humans everywhere, addressed through the particular medium of Egyptian religious tradition. The Theban priests who would welcome the Nubian conquerors were not simply choosing the lesser evil between foreign rulers. They were choosing rulers who shared their religious values, who respected Amun above all other gods, who would support the temple establishment rather than trying to subordinate it. The alliance between Theban priests and Nubian kings was a natural partnership, built on shared devotion to Amun and mutual interest in establishing stable authority over Egypt. This alliance would prove remarkably durable, surviving even the eventual Assyrian conquest and continuing to shape Egyptian politics for generations. The lesson that emerges from the divided period is that political unity cannot be taken for granted. Egypt had been unified for so long that Egyptians may have assumed unity was natural, that the two lands would always be one. The divided period demonstrated that unity required active maintenance, that centrifugal forces would tear any polity apart if not constantly counteracted by centralizing institutions and ideologies. The pharaonic system had provided this counterforce for millennia, but when that system weakened, nothing adequate replaced it. The Libyans couldn't create unity through military force alone. The priests couldn't create unity through religious authority alone. Unity required something that neither faction could provide on its own, and in its absence, Egypt remained divided, weakened, and vulnerable to the foreign powers that would soon arrive to impose order from outside. The most unexpected plot twist in Egyptian history came marching up the Nile around 747 BCE, and it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. While the Libyans were busy squabbling over the delta, and the Theban priests were consulting their oracles about which faction to back this week, a power had been quietly consolidating in the south that would soon reshape everything. The Nubians were coming, and they were coming not as barbarian invaders but as the most Egyptian people in the world who just happened to not be Egyptian. This is one of those historical ironies that almost seems too perfect to be true. For centuries, Egypt had conquered, colonized, and culturally dominated Nubia. Egyptian temples had been built in Nubian lands. Egyptian gods had been imposed on Nubian populations. Egyptian officials had administered Nubian territories, extracting gold and tribute while spreading Egyptian language, art, and religion. The Egyptians had been so successful at this cultural imperialism that the Nubians had become, in many ways, more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, more devoted to traditional worship, more committed to classical artistic forms, more reverent toward the old ways that Egypt's own rulers seemed to be abandoning. The kingdom of Kush, centered far up the Nile in what is now Sudan, had emerged from centuries of Egyptian colonial rule as an independent state with thoroughly Egyptian cultural foundations. The Kushite kings wore Egyptian regalia, wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphs, worshipped Egyptian gods, and styled themselves according to Egyptian royal protocols. But they also maintained their own traditions, distinctive burial practices, particular devotion to certain deities, and a fierce independence that they had won through long struggle against declining Egyptian power. They were Egyptians by adoption, Nubians by birth, and they believed they understood what Egypt was supposed to be better than the actual Egyptians did. The religious justification for Nubian intervention in Egypt centered on a remarkable geographic feature, Jebel Barkal, a sandstone mountain rising dramatically from the Nubian plain near the fourth cataract of the Nile. This mountain, with its distinctive pinnacle that resembled a rearing cobra, the uraeus that symbolized Egyptian royal power, had been identified during the New Kingdom as a southern residence of Amun, the king of the gods. Egyptian pharaohs had built temples at its base, and the local priesthood had developed traditions that linked Jebel Barkal to Amun's mythological origins. For the Kushite kings, Jebel Barkal was nothing less than the birthplace of Amun himself, the original source of divine power from which Egyptian religion had derived. This was a bold theological claim, essentially arguing that Nubia was the authentic centre of Amun worship, while Egypt was merely a northern colony that had strayed from true practice. But it was exactly the kind of ideological framework needed to justify Nubian intervention in Egyptian affairs. The Kushites weren't conquering Egypt. They were restoring it to proper worship of a god whose true home was in their territory all along. The first Kushite pharaoh to make serious moves into Egypt was Piye, whose campaign of conquest around 747 to 730 BCE established the 25th dynasty. Piye's account of his campaign, preserved on a massive stela from Jebel Barkal, is one of the most remarkable documents in ancient history. A detailed narrative of military operations combined with religious pronouncements that reveals the mindset of a ruler who genuinely believed he was on a divine mission. Piye didn't describe himself as a foreign conqueror, but as a servant of Amun come to restore order to a land that had fallen into chaos and impiety. The campaign itself was a masterpiece of military and diplomatic strategy. Piye moved north systematically, accepting the submission of rulers who surrendered peacefully while besieging those who resisted. The major Libyan strongholds in the delta proved stubborn, but Piye's forces were experienced and well-organised, veterans of warfare in the harsh Nubian environment. One by one, the northern cities fell or submitted, until Piye controlled the entire length of the Nile from the Mediterranean to deep in the Nubian heartland. But here's where Piye's behaviour becomes fascinating and slightly puzzling. After conquering all of Egypt, after accepting the submission of every regional ruler, after proving beyond doubt that he was the supreme power in the land, Piye went home. He returned to his capital at Napata near Jebel Barkal, apparently content to rule Egypt through local subordinates rather than establishing himself in Memphis or Thebes. His successors would spend more time in Egypt proper, but Piye's decision to remain based in Nubia suggests that he saw himself primarily as a Nubian king who happened to also rule Egypt, rather than as an Egyptian pharaoh who happened to come from Nubia. This geographic choice had significant implications for how the 25th dynasty governed Egypt. The Kushite pharaohs were never fully present in the way that native Egyptian rulers had been. They maintained their primary residence far to the south, visiting Egypt for major ceremonies and crises, but governing through intermediaries much of the time. This created space for Egyptian institutions to continue functioning more or less autonomously, particularly the priesthood of Amun at Thebes, which found the Kushites to be extremely congenial overlords. The priests got a ruler who genuinely shared their religious commitments. The Kushites got local partners who could manage Egyptian affairs while they focused on their Nubian power base. Piye's son and successor Shabaka made the dynasty's control over Egypt more direct, establishing a stronger presence in Memphis and pursuing more ambitious building projects. Shabaka was particularly active in restoring and expanding Egyptian temples, pouring resources into religious construction that demonstrated both piety and power. His famous Memphite theology, a text carved on a basalt slab that he claimed to have copied from an ancient worm-eaten papyrus, articulated theological ideas about the creator god Ptah that may have been genuinely ancient or may have been creative reinterpretation dressed up as antiquarian discovery. Either way, it represented the Kushite commitment to preserving and promoting Egyptian religious tradition. The golden age of the 25th dynasty came under Taharqa, who ruled from approximately 690 to 664 BCE and oversaw what can only be called a Nubian-Egyptian cultural renaissance. Taharqa was ambitious in ways that his predecessors had not been, launching major building projects throughout Egypt and Nubia, engaging in international diplomacy, and attempting to project power into the Levant in ways that would prove dangerously provocative. Under Taharqa, the 25th dynasty reached its greatest extent and its highest cultural achievements, and also set itself on a collision course with the most powerful military machine in the ancient world. Taharqa's building program was extraordinary in both scale and intent. At Karnak, he constructed a massive colonnade in the first courtyard of the Great Amun Temple, with columns so large that they rivaled the great hypostyle hall built by Rameses II. At Jebel Barkal, he expanded the Amun temple complex with new constructions that rivaled anything in Egypt proper. Throughout both countries, he renovated existing temples, constructed new ones, and sponsored religious institutions that had been neglected during the chaotic years of Libyan rule. The pyramids built by Kushite rulers deserve particular attention because they represent one of the most striking examples of cultural revival in ancient history. The Great Pyramids of Egypt had been built during the Old Kingdom, over 1,000 years before the Kushite conquest. Native Egyptian kings had long since abandoned pyramid burial in favour of rock-cut tombs or other arrangements. But the Kushites, with their reverence for ancient Egyptian tradition, revived pyramid construction at their royal cemeteries near Napata and later Meroe. These Nubian pyramids weren't exact copies of their Egyptian models. They were steeper, smaller, and architecturally distinctive. But they represented a deliberate choice to connect Kushite kingship with the most impressive architectural tradition in Egyptian history. By building pyramids, the Kushite pharaohs were saying something about their relationship to Egyptian heritage. We are the true heirs of the pyramid builders, the authentic continuators of traditions that Egypt itself has forgotten. The visual statement was powerful, and hundreds of these pyramids would eventually be constructed over the following centuries, making the Nubian royal cemeteries among the most remarkable archaeological sites in Africa. The religious policies of the 25th dynasty reflected the Kushites' genuine devotion to Amun, and their desire to restore Egyptian tradition to what they believed was its proper state. The Theban priests, who had been locked in political competition with Libyan pharaohs for centuries, found in the Kushites rulers who actually shared their religious priorities. Temple revenues were restored and expanded. Priestly privileges were confirmed and enhanced. The cult of Amun received support on a scale not seen since the New Kingdom. The institution of the divine wife of Amun reached new heights of importance under Kushite rule. Pa installed his sister Amenerdis as divine wife, establishing a Kushite woman at the centre of Theban religious life. Her successors, drawn from both Kushite and Egyptian families, exercised enormous power over Upper Egypt, controlling temple revenues and exercising political authority that made them nearly independent rulers within the larger Kushite Egyptian state. The divine wives built their own monuments, maintained their own staffs, and conducted their own diplomacy, a remarkable degree of female authority in the ancient world. The administrative integration of Egypt under the 25th dynasty was relatively light-handed, reflecting both the Kushites' respect for Egyptian institutions and their practical limitations in governing a large, complex territory from their distant capital. Local rulers who had submitted to Pa were generally left in place, provided they acknowledged Kushite supremacy and maintained order in their territories. The result was a kind of federal structure, with the Kushite pharaoh as supreme overlord but local Egyptian and Libyan rulers maintaining significant autonomy at the regional level. This light-handed approach had advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, it allowed Egyptian institutions to continue functioning without major disruption, maintaining the administrative continuity that made taxation, justice, and public works possible. On the negative side, it left local power structures intact that could potentially be exploited by foreign enemies, a vulnerability that would prove critical when Assyria turned its attention toward Egypt. The international position of 25th dynasty Egypt was complicated by the rise of Assyrian power in the Near East. The Assyrians had built the most formidable military machine the world had yet seen, conquering a vast empire that stretched from Persia to the Mediterranean. Egypt, with its wealth and strategic position, was an obvious target for Assyrian expansion. But Egypt was also a potential ally for the smaller states of the Levant that were trying to resist Assyrian domination. This created a dangerous dynamic in which Egypt was drawn into conflicts with Assyria through its support for anti-Assyrian coalitions, provoking exactly the confrontation it should have been trying to avoid. Taharqa was particularly active in Levantine diplomacy, supporting rebellions against Assyrian authority and attempting to project Egyptian influence into regions that had once been part of the New Kingdom Empire. This forward foreign policy was understandable from an Egyptian perspective. The Levant had been Egyptian territory within living memory, and supporting anti-Assyrian movements seemed like a way to build a buffer zone against the expanding empire. But it was also extremely dangerous, since it essentially challenged a power that Egypt was in no position to defeat militarily. The artistic achievements of the 25th dynasty represent one of the most fascinating chapters in Egyptian cultural history, a period when Nubian and Egyptian elements merged to create something genuinely new while remaining deeply rooted in ancient tradition. This wasn't simply Egyptian art produced by Nubian patrons. It was a creative synthesis that drew on both cultural traditions to produce works of striking originality and power. The most immediately visible feature of Kushite art was the treatment of royal figures. Egyptian artistic tradition had long idealized royal bodies, depicting pharaohs with perfect proportions regardless of their actual physical appearance. Kushite artists continued this tradition in many respects, but added distinctively Nubian elements that reflected their cultural identity. Kushite kings were often shown with darker skin tones than traditional Egyptian representations, with facial features that reflected Nubian rather than Egyptian ideals of beauty, and sometimes with elements of Nubian dress or decoration alongside Egyptian regalia. The question of skin colour in Egyptian and Nubian art is complicated and has been entangled in modern debates about race that ancient people would have found incomprehensible. What we can say is that Kushite artists made deliberate choices to distinguish their rulers from the Egyptian artistic tradition, while still working within that tradition's broader framework. The Kushite pharaohs wanted to be seen as Egyptian kings, but they also wanted to be recognised as Kushites, and their art reflected this dual identity in ways that previous foreign rulers of Egypt had not attempted. The depiction of deities during the 25th dynasty shows similar patterns of creative synthesis. The goddess Mut, Amun's consort, was particularly important in Kushite religious practice, and her representations during this period show interesting developments. Some images of Mut from the Kushite period incorporate what appear to be tribal scarification marks, parallel lines on the cheeks that were characteristic of certain African peoples and that would have been foreign to Egyptian artistic tradition. These marks transformed Mut from a purely Egyptian goddess into a figure that could speak to Nubian as well as Egyptian worshippers, a visual statement that the gods belong to both peoples. Similar patterns appear in representations of other deities. Kushite artists maintained the basic iconography of Egyptian gods, their characteristic crowns, animal associations, and symbolic attributes, while adding details that gave these figures a Nubian dimension. The result was a religious art that was recognisably Egyptian to anyone familiar with that tradition, but that also incorporated elements that spoke specifically to Nubian cultural identity. This was syncretism in action, the creative merger of religious traditions that occurs when cultures meet and interpenetrate. Taharqa's reliefs represent the high point of this artistic synthesis. His constructions at Karnak, Jebel Barkal, and other sites were decorated with elaborate scenes that combined Egyptian iconographic traditions with new compositional approaches and decorative elements. The use of gold and lapis lazuli in these reliefs, precious materials that transformed temple walls into gleaming displays of divine power, reflected both the wealth of the 25th dynasty and its commitment to artistic excellence. These weren't budget productions. They were meant to rival and surpass the achievements of the great New Kingdom pharaohs. The compositional innovations in Kushite relief sculpture are subtle but significant. While following the basic conventions of Egyptian two-dimensional art, the distinctive combination of frontal and profile views, the hierarchical scaling of figures, the orderly registers of narrative, Kushite artists introduced variations that gave their work a distinctive character. Figures were sometimes more densely packed, creating busy, energetic compositions that contrasted with the more spacious layouts of traditional Egyptian relief. Details of costume and ornament were often more elaborate, reflecting both Nubian decorative traditions and a general taste for visual richness. The small-scale arts of the 25th dynasty, jewellery, bronze figurines, carved ornaments, similarly demonstrate the merger of Egyptian and Nubian traditions. Kushite jewellery combined Egyptian protective symbols with Nubian decorative preferences, creating objects that would have been appropriate for elite Egyptians, but that also reflected the cultural identity of their Nubian wearers. Bronze figurines of gods and kings showed the same dual character, following Egyptian iconographic conventions while incorporating the distinctively Nubian features that marked Kushite royal representations. The tomb paintings and reliefs of the Kushite period extended these artistic innovations into the funerary realm. Kushite nobles who were buried in Egypt followed Egyptian funerary customs, mummification, provision of grave goods, decoration of tombs with scenes of afterlife activities, but they often did so with variations that reflected their Nubian identity. Family groups might be shown with Nubian features and costume elements alongside Egyptian burial equipment. The protective spells and images that were supposed to ensure successful passage to the afterlife might include both Egyptian and Nubian religious elements. The textiles of the 25th dynasty, though few have survived, appear to have been particularly sophisticated. Descriptions and fragmentary remains suggest elaborate woven fabrics that combined Egyptian weaving techniques with Nubian colour preferences and decorative patterns. Clothing was always an important marker of identity in ancient societies, and the Kushite elite seem to have dressed in ways that marked them as both Egyptian and Nubian, participating in Egyptian material culture while maintaining visible signs of their distinct origin. The intellectual culture of the 25th dynasty reflected the same dual heritage as its art. Kushite scribes were trained in Egyptian writing systems, both hieroglyphic and hieratic, and produced texts that followed Egyptian literary conventions. But the content of some of these texts reflected Nubian perspectives and concerns. The Great Stela of Piae, for instance, is written in entirely conventional Egyptian style, but narrates events from a Nubian perspective and emphasizes themes like devotion to Amun and disgust at impiety that were particularly important in Kushite ideology. The Kushites also seem to have maintained their own language alongside Egyptian, using it for everyday communication even as they employed Egyptian for official and religious purposes. This bilingualism was common in colonial and post-colonial situations, where elite languages coexist with vernacular ones, and it suggests that Kushite culture retained its distinctiveness even as it deeply engaged with Egyptian civilization. The eventual development of Meroitic writing, a script derived from Egyptian but used to write the Nubian language, shows that this linguistic heritage would eventually find its own written expression. The gender dynamics of Kushite Egyptian culture deserve attention because they differed in some respects from Egyptian norms. Nubian societies appear to have given women more prominent roles in certain contexts than was typical in Egypt. The importance of queen mothers in Kushite royal succession, the powerful positions held by divine wives of Amun, and certain representations of royal women in Kushite art all suggest a society where female authority was more visible and perhaps more substantial than in purely Egyptian contexts. The Kushite queens, known by the title Kandake, which Greek and Roman sources would render as Candace, were particularly powerful figures in Nubian political life. While this institution reached its fullest development after the 25th dynasty, during the later Meroitic period, its roots were visible even during Kushite rule of Egypt. Royal women were depicted in contexts that emphasized their power and authority, shown wearing the crowns of rulership and performing actions that in Egyptian tradition were reserved for male kings. This was not Egyptian art. It was something new, built from Egyptian elements but expressing Nubian values. The material culture of everyday life during the 25th dynasty probably changed less dramatically than the art of royal courts and temples. Ordinary Egyptians continued using the same pottery, tools and household objects that their ancestors had used, produced by the same workshops following the same traditions. The Kushite conquest was an elite phenomenon. It changed who sat on the throne, who commanded the armies, who dedicated temples to the gods, but it left the basic fabric of Egyptian daily life relatively undisturbed. This continuity at the popular level was important for the stability of Kushite rule. The Kushites didn't try to impose Nubian culture on ordinary Egyptians. They presented themselves as restorers of Egyptian tradition, not as foreign innovators. This approach earned them acceptance from the Egyptian population that might have resisted more aggressive cultural transformation. The Kushites ruled Egypt with Egyptian institutions, employed Egyptian officials, and presented themselves through Egyptian ideological frameworks, all while maintaining their own distinct identity at the top of the social hierarchy. The architectural legacy of the 25th dynasty was substantial, though much has been destroyed or obscured by later constructions. At Thebes, Kushite building activity focused on the Amun temple complex, adding new structures and renovating old ones. At Memphis, the ancient capital of Lower Egypt, the Kushites invested in constructions that proclaimed their presence in the north. But the most distinctive Kushite architecture was in Nubia itself, where the royal cemeteries with their steep pyramids and the temple complexes at Jebel Barkal and other sites created a built environment that was uniquely Kushite, Egyptian in inspiration, but African in execution. The engineering techniques employed in Kushite construction represented a merger of Egyptian and local traditions. Egyptian methods of stone cutting, moving and placement were adapted to Nubian conditions and materials. Local sandstone rather than the limestone favoured in Egypt was the primary building material, requiring adjustments in construction techniques. The result was architecture that looked Egyptian from a distance, but that up close revealed its Nubian character in materials, proportions and decorative details. The religious practices of the 25th dynasty combined Egyptian ritual with what appear to have been Nubian elements. The Kushites were famous for their devotion to Amun, and their worship of the god followed Egyptian patterns in many respects. But certain aspects of Kushite religion, the importance of sacred mountains like Jebel Barkal, the role of the ram as Amun's sacred animal, particular festival practices, may have represented Nubian contributions to the broader tradition. Distinguishing between pure Egyptian practice and Nubian innovations is difficult, since the Kushites themselves insisted that their worship represented authentic Egyptian tradition, and who was in a position to argue with them? The funerary practices of the Kushite elite showed similar patterns of combination. The Kushites adopted Egyptian mummification, employed Egyptian burial equipment, and decorated their tombs with Egyptian funerary scenes. But they were buried in pyramids, a form that Egypt itself had abandoned, and their burial positions and orientations sometimes differed from Egyptian norms. The graves of Kushite kings contained objects that were purely Nubian, alongside the Egyptian-style equipment, suggesting that the afterlife they envisioned contained room for both cultural traditions. The legacy of the 25th dynasty for Egyptian art history was profound, though not always recognised. The Kushite period demonstrated that Egyptian artistic tradition was flexible enough to accommodate foreign contributions while maintaining its essential character. It showed that authentic Egyptian culture could be produced by people who were not ethnically Egyptian, that cultural participation mattered more than biological descent. This lesson would be repeated when Greeks and later Romans ruled Egypt, producing art that was recognisably Egyptian despite its foreign patronage. The Kushite artistic synthesis also influenced later developments in both Egypt and Nubia. In Egypt, some of the stylistic innovations of the 25th dynasty persisted into subsequent periods, particularly the so-called Sate Renaissance that followed Assyrian domination. In Nubia, the artistic traditions established during the 25th dynasty continued to develop for centuries, eventually producing the distinctive Meroitic culture that flourished until the early centuries of the Common Era. The pyramids of Meroe, the last echo of the Egyptian pyramid tradition, were built by rulers who traced their heritage back to the great pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. But the Kushite Golden Age was about to end, not through internal failure but through external catastrophe. The Assyrians, whom Taharqa had provoked through his Levantine diplomacy, were preparing to demonstrate that their military machine was capable of reaching even distant Egypt. The confrontation that followed would be devastating for the 25th dynasty, driving the Kushites back to their Nubian homeland and inaugurating a new phase of Egyptian history characterized by foreign domination and cultural defensiveness. The tragedy of the 25th dynasty was that its very virtues contributed to its downfall. The Kushites' commitment to Egyptian tradition made them popular with the priesthood, but didn't prepare them for the brutal realities of Assyrian warfare. Their reverence for the past made them excellent cultural custodians, but not necessarily effective military innovators. Their loose administrative style, which preserved Egyptian institutional continuity, also preserved the local power structures that Assyria would exploit to divide and conquer. Yet the Kushite legacy was not erased by their military defeat. Their artistic innovations persisted, their religious policies shaped Egyptian practice for generations, and their example demonstrated that Egyptian civilization could be maintained by foreign rulers who genuinely embraced its values. The 25th dynasty was not just a period of foreign domination, it was a genuine renaissance, a creative flowering that produced some of the most interesting art and architecture in Egyptian history. The Nubians had come as saviours, and in cultural terms at least they had delivered on their promises. The cultural fusion achieved under Kushite rule represented something unusual in ancient history, a synthesis in which both contributing traditions were enriched, rather than one simply absorbing the other. Egyptian art gained new possibilities from Nubian contributions. Nubian culture gained the prestige and sophistication of Egyptian tradition. The result was not a diluted compromise but a creative enhancement, a demonstration that cultural mixing could produce something greater than its components. This lesson would be tested again when subsequent conquerors, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, imposed their authority on Egypt. Each would have to negotiate the relationship between their own cultural traditions and the immense prestige of Egyptian civilization. The Kushite example showed one way to handle this challenge. Embrace Egyptian traditions so thoroughly that you become its champion, contribute your own elements without claiming to replace what exists, and present yourself as restorer rather than innovator. It was an approach that required genuine respect for the conquered civilization, and not all of Egypt's subsequent rulers would possess that respect. The pyramids that the Kushites built still stand in the Sudanese desert, weathered but recognizable, markers of a remarkable chapter in African history. They are Egyptian in inspiration but Nubian in execution, products of a culture that drew on the full length of the Nile for its identity. When visitors see them today, smaller than their Egyptian models but more numerous, steeper in profile but equally devoted to the idea of eternal royal burial, they are seeing the material legacy of a people who loved Egyptian civilization so much that they tried to save it. and who in the process created something new that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely Nubian, but authentically both. The administrative innovations of the 25th dynasty, though less visible than their artistic achievements, were equally significant for Egyptian history. The Kushites developed systems for governing their dual kingdom that balanced central authority with local autonomy, creating administrative structures that would influence Egyptian governance long after the dynasty itself had fallen. Their approach to taxation, their management of temple estates, their coordination of military forces across vast distances, all of these represented solutions to problems that Egypt had been struggling with since the end of the New Kingdom. The communication networks that held the Kushite Empire together were particularly impressive. Messages had to travel over 1,000 miles from Napata to the Mediterranean, passing through multiple administrative zones and crossing the difficult terrain of the Nubian desert. The Kushites developed courier systems, way stations, and administrative protocols that made this long-distance governance possible. Some of these systems may have been inherited from earlier Egyptian practice, but their extension into the Deep South required innovation and adaptation to local conditions. The military organisation of the 25th dynasty combined Egyptian and Nubian traditions in ways that reflected the dynasty's dual heritage. Egyptian-style infantry and chariotry were supplemented by Nubian units that brought their own distinctive combat traditions. Kushite archers were particularly renowned. Nubia had been called the land of the bow by Egyptians for millennia, and their skills gave Kushite armies capabilities that purely Egyptian forces might have lacked. The challenge was integrating these diverse elements into a coherent fighting force, a challenge that the Kushites met with varying degrees of success. The naval capabilities of the 25th dynasty have received less attention than their land forces, but control of the Nile was essential to their power. The river was the main transportation route for the entire kingdom, and whoever controlled river traffic controlled the movement of goods, troops, and messages. The Kushites maintained river fleets that could move forces rapidly up and down the Nile, giving them strategic flexibility that land-based movement alone could not provide. This river power was particularly important for maintaining contact between the distant capital at Napata and the Egyptian territories to the north. The economic policies of the Kushites reflected their understanding of Egyptian prosperity and their desire to maintain it. They supported the agricultural infrastructure that was the foundation of Egyptian wealth, the irrigation systems, the granaries, the distribution networks that turned Nile floods into stored grain and stored grain into political power. They also encouraged trade, both the Mediterranean commerce that enriched the delta and the African trade routes that brought gold, ivory, and exotic goods from the interior of the continent. The gold resources of Nubia were particularly important to Kushite power. Egypt had always valued Nubian gold. The New Kingdom pharaohs had conquered Nubia partly to secure access to its gold mines, and the Kushites now controlled these resources directly. This wealth funded their building programs, paid their armies, and gave them diplomatic leverage in their dealings with other powers. Gold from Kushite mines flowed into Egyptian temples, purchasing the materials and labour needed for the ambitious construction projects that marked Taharka's reign. The diplomatic relations of the 25th dynasty extended beyond the immediate region to include contacts with the emerging Greek world. Greek traders and mercenaries were increasingly present in Egypt during this period, and the Kushites seem to have welcomed them as useful participants in Egyptian commerce and military affairs. This openness to Greek involvement would have long-term consequences for Egyptian history, laying the groundwork for the more intensive Greek engagement that would follow under the Site dynasty and eventually the Ptolemies. The intellectual exchange between Kushite and Egyptian traditions during the 25th dynasty may have been more substantial than surviving evidence reveals. The Kushites brought their own cultural knowledge, their astronomical observations, their medical practices, their understanding of the African environment into contact with Egyptian learning. Whether this produced significant innovations is difficult to determine, since the evidence for intellectual life during this period is fragmentary. But the mere fact of cultural contact at elite levels suggests that some exchange of ideas must have occurred. The religious syncretism of the Kushite period extended to deities beyond the major Egyptian gods. Local Nubian spirits and divine powers were probably incorporated into the broader religious framework, given Egyptian-style representations while maintaining their Nubian identities. This kind of syncretism was typical of ancient religions, which tended to add new gods to their pantheons rather than replacing old ones. The result was a religious landscape of considerable complexity, where worshippers could draw on both Egyptian and Nubian divine resources depending on their needs and preferences. The festivals of the 25th dynasty combined Egyptian ceremonial traditions with what may have been Nubian elements. The great festivals of Amun at Thebes continued on their traditional schedules, drawing participants from across Upper Egypt and providing opportunities for the Kushite pharaohs to display their piety and power. But these festivals may have incorporated new elements, music, dance, ritual actions, that reflected Nubian cultural contributions. The evidence for festival practice is unfortunately limited, since most of what we know comes from temple inscriptions that describe ideal ceremonial forms rather than actual practice. The treatment of the dead during the Kushite period showed interesting variations from earlier Egyptian practice. While elite burials followed Egyptian patterns in most respects, some details suggest Nubian influence, or at least Nubian preferences. The orientation of bodies, the arrangement of grave goods, the types of objects included in burials, all of these could vary in ways that distinguished Kushite burials from purely Egyptian ones. These variations were subtle rather than dramatic, reflecting the general pattern of Kushite culture, thoroughly Egyptian in most respects, but with distinctive elements that marked Kushite identity. The role of horses in Kushite culture was particularly notable. The Kushites were famous horse breeders, and their cavalry capabilities exceeded what Egypt itself could produce. Royal tombs at the Kushite capital included horse burials, animals sacrificed to accompany their royal masters into the afterlife, a practice that had no parallel in Egyptian tradition. This love of horses was not just military utility, it was a cultural value that the Kushites brought with them into their Egyptian empire, and that distinguished them from the Egyptian population they ruled. The clothing and personal adornment of the Kushite elite combined Egyptian and Nubian elements in ways that proclaimed their dual identity. Royal figures might be shown wearing Egyptian crowns and Nubian jewellery, combining symbols from both traditions in a single image. Clothing styles probably showed similar patterns of combination, with Egyptian garments supplemented by Nubian accessories or vice versa. This visual code allowed Kushite elites to navigate between their two cultural worlds, signalling different aspects of their identity in different contexts. The language situation in 25th dynasty Egypt was complex. Egyptian remained the language of administration, religion and high culture, and Kushite rulers became fluent in it for official purposes. But Nubian languages were probably spoken at the Kushite court and in Nubian communities throughout the empire. This bilingualism had practical implications for administration. Officials needed to communicate in different languages depending on their audience, and cultural implications for identity. The Kushites were always, in some sense, operating in two linguistic worlds, never fully at home in either one. The succession practices of the 25th dynasty reflected Nubian rather than purely Egyptian traditions. In Kushite culture, the throne could pass to brothers, nephews, or other relatives rather than exclusively from father to son. This lateral succession pattern made Kushite royal politics more complex than Egyptian tradition allowed, with multiple potential heirs competing for position. The result was sometimes conflict within the royal family, as different lines claimed precedence based on different interpretations of succession rules. The position of the Queen Mother in Kushite society was particularly powerful, exceeding anything comparable in Egyptian tradition. Royal mothers could exercise significant political influence, and their status was recognized in official representations and protocols. This matrilineal element in Kushite culture, the importance of the royal woman through whom legitimate succession passed, gave women a structural importance in politics that Egyptian tradition did not provide. The powerful divine wives of Amun at Thebes were partly a Kushite innovation, extending into Egyptian institutions a role for royal women that reflected Nubian cultural values. The provincial administration of the 25th dynasty relied heavily on local officials who owed their positions to Kushite patronage, but who were often Egyptian in background. These officials were the interface between Kushite authority and Egyptian society, translating royal demands into local action and local concerns into information that could travel up the administrative hierarchy. Their position required cultural competence in both traditions, understanding what Kushite rulers wanted while knowing how to achieve it within Egyptian social structures. The legal administration of the period continued Egyptian judicial traditions, with courts operating according to established principles and procedures. The Kushites don't seem to have attempted to impose Nubian legal customs on Egypt. Instead, they allowed Egyptian law to continue functioning under their overall authority. This legal continuity was important for social stability, since property rights, contract enforcement and criminal justice all depended on predictable legal processes that the population understood and trusted. The temple economies of the 25th dynasty flourished under Kushite patronage. Royal donations enriched temple estates, enabling expanded services and attracting additional personnel. The temples became more important as centres of local power during this period, partly because the Kushite pharaohs encouraged their development, and partly because central administration was focused far away in Napata. This strengthening of temple economies would have lasting effects on Egyptian society, creating institutional power centres that would survive the fall of the 25th dynasty itself. The craft production of the period showed the sophistication that Kushite patronage and Egyptian tradition could produce together. Metalworkers created elaborate gold and silver objects that combined Egyptian iconography with Nubian decorative preferences. Stone carvers produced sculptures that maintained Egyptian formal conventions while incorporating the distinctive features of Kushite representation. Jewelers, weavers, potters, and other craftspeople continued their traditional work, sometimes producing purely Egyptian objects, and sometimes creating pieces that showed the influence of their Kushite patrons. The training of craftsmen during this period maintained the workshop tradition